close your eyes and let the heaviness of the day dissolve into the velvet dark, imagining yourself drifting backward through the mists of time, past the noise of the modern world, until you find yourself standing in the hushed, stone-walled silence of a great medieval chamber, where the air smells of beeswax candles, dried lavender, and the faint, metallic tang of an iron brazier warming the chill of a winter night in 1328. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. End of part 1. The light here is low, casting long, dancing shadows against tapestries that tell stories of hunts and heroes. And outside, the wind howls across the English Channel, a restless spirit moving between two great lands that are about to be bound together in a century of fire and steel. Though for now, there is only the quiet scratching of a quill on parchment and the murmuring of worried counsellors. We begin our story not with the clash of swords, but with the silence of a deathbed in France, where Charles IV, the King of France, takes his final breath, leaving behind a kingdom, a crown, and a problem that is more tangled than a pair of headphones left in a pocket for too long. You see, Charles has died without a male heir, ending the direct line of the Capetian dynasty, a family that has ruled France for over 300 years with the stability of an oak tree, but now the oak has fallen and the forest is open to wolves. The question whispered in every court from Paris to London is simply, who rules now? It is here that we meet the woman who stands at the very centre of this storm, a figure of striking intelligence and formidable will, Isabella of France, known to history as the She-Wolf, a nickname that historians suspect was given to her not because she was wild, but because she was a woman who dared to be as ruthless as the men around her. Isabella is the sister of the dead French king, and she is also the mother of the young King Edward III of England, a boy of only 15 who possesses the energy of a coiled spring and the ambition of a Caesar. In the logic of blood, Isabella's son has the strongest claim to the French throne, for he is the closest living male relative to the late king. But there is a catch, a legal hurdle, that the French nobility hastily dusts off from the archives of history to block an English king from sitting on their throne. They cite an ancient code known as Salic law, a set of rules dating back to the chaotic days of the early Franks, which supposedly forbids the crown from passing to a woman or through a woman's lineage, though modern scholars often argue that this law was less of an ancient sacred tradition and more of a convenient legal loophole discovered just in time to keep the English out. It is a bit like finding a rule in the instruction manual of a board game only when you are losing, claiming that actually, according to page 42, you win. So, instead of the young Edward III, the French crown is placed upon the head of Philip of Valois, a cousin who becomes Philip VI, a man of courtly grace, but perhaps lacking the iron spine required for the epoch about to unfold. Across the narrow sea, in the draughty halls of Westminster, the teenage Edward III is furious, his pride wounded, but he is also patient, guided by his mother, who knows the dangerous game of thrones better than anyone. Yet for the moment, the young English king plays the part of the obedient vassal. In 1329, in a scene rich with medieval pageantry, Edward travels to the Cathedral of Amiens to pay homage to Philip VI for his lands in France, specifically the Duchy of Aquitaine, a vast and wealthy wine-producing region in the southwest that has belonged to English kings for generations. Picture the scene. The cathedral is a soaring masterpiece of Gothic stone, the stained glass throwing pools of ruby and sapphire light onto the stone floor, and there stands Edward, wearing a robe of crimson velvet embroidered with leopards, kneeling before Philip, who is draped in the blue of France, covered in golden lilies. It is a moment of supreme tension, hidden beneath the polite rituals of chivalry, for while Edward kneels, his heart remains standing, and the words of loyalty he speaks are vague, carefully chosen to avoid admitting that Philip is truly his superior. It is a diplomatic dance, a performance where everyone knows the lines, but no one believes them. For several years, an uneasy peace hangs over the Channel, like the heavy humid air before a thunderstorm, while beneath the surface the true engines of war are beginning to turn, driven not just by dynastic pride, but by the very fabric of the medieval economy. Wool. England is a land of sheep, producing the finest, thickest wool in Europe, but the great weaving looms that turn that wool into cloth are in Flanders, a region technically loyal to the French king, but economically married to English sheep farmers. When Philip VI, sensing Edward's growing defiance, begins to interfere in Flanders and threatens to confiscate the Duchy of Aquitaine, he threatens not just Edward's titles, but England's wallet. It is often said that wars are fought for honour, but they are usually funded by trade, and the threat to the wool trade is the spark that finally ignites the dry tinder of ambition. In 1337, the final break occurs when Philip VI, tired of Edward's arrogance, formally declares that Aquitaine is forfeited to the French crown, a move intended to humble the English king, but instead it liberates him. Edward III does something audacious, something that makes the courts of Europe gasp. He does not just declare war to defend his lands, he declares himself the true King of France, quartering his coat of arms so that the English lions are suddenly sharing space with the French fleur-de-lis, a heraldic shout of defiance that says, "I am not coming to conquer, I am coming to collect what is mine." The she-wolf, Isabella, watches her son with what we might imagine is a grim satisfaction, seeing the blood of her father and brothers rising to reclaim its legacy. We must remember that in the 14th century, nationalism as we know it does not really exist. A peasant in Normandy feels more loyalty to his local duke than to a distant king in Paris, and the languages spoken on both sides of the Channel are a mix of dialects, with the English court still speaking French as the language of refinement. The war that is beginning is not yet England versus France in the modern sense. It is a family feud that has spiraled effectively out of control, a divorce proceeding settled with armies instead of lawyers. As the year 1337 turns towards winter, the atmosphere in England shifts from diplomatic whispering to the clangour of preparation. In the shires, the sheriffs are ordering the fletchers to make arrows, thousands of them, tipped with bodkin points, capable of piercing mail, while in the forests the yew trees are being eyed for the making of longbows, a weapon that the French aristocracy still regards with the same disdain a master chef might have for a microwave. Effective perhaps, but lacking in soul. Edward begins to build alliances, paying vast sums of gold to German princes and Flemish burghers, weaving a web of support that he hopes will encircle Philip. Meanwhile, in Paris, Philip calls upon the chivalry of France, the greatest knights in Christendom, men who live by a code of honour that values the magnificent charge, the shining armour, and the individual feat of arms above all else. They are like beautiful, metal-clad dinosaurs, unaware that the meteor is already streaking across the sky. There is a sense of inevitability now, a momentum that cannot be stopped, as ships are gathered in the harbours of the south coast of England, their hulls creaking against the docks, smelling of tar and salt. The she-wolf's claim has become a sword in her son's hand. The legal arguments are over, the parchments are rolled away, and the time for ink has passed. Now the Channel is grey and choppy, reflecting a sky that seems to mourn in advance for the generations that will bleed before this struggle is done. The long twilight of the Middle Ages is deepening, and as the sun sets on the old peace, we can almost hear the first distant rumble of thunder, not from the heavens, but from the marching of feet and the sharpening of steel. The first arrow has been drawn from the quiver, the string is pulled taut against the cheek, and the world holds its breath waiting for the release. The calendar turns to June, in the year 1340, and the world smells of brine and tar. We find ourselves standing on the heaving deck of a wooden cog, the primary workhorse of the medieval seas, a vessel that looks less like a sleek ship of war and more like a floating castle tower, round and tub-like, bobbing in the chop of the North Sea. King Edward III is here, commanding a fleet that has gathered like a swarm of angry wasps in the Orwell estuary on the southeast coast of England. He is no longer the boy king kneeling in a cathedral. He is 27 years old, a man entering his prime, clad in armour that glints with the dull sheen of polished steel under the grey English sky. He is about to do something that few kings dare. He is leading his army personally across the water, straight into the teeth of an enemy blockade. The French, aware of Edward's alliances in Flanders, have assembled a massive armada to stop him, anchoring their ships in the inlet of Sluys, a silty tidal harbour on the border of what is now the Netherlands and Belgium. As the English fleet sails closer, the horizon begins to change, not with storm clouds, but with wood. The chroniclers of the time, who loved a bit of dramatic exaggeration but were likely not far off the mark here, described the French fleet as a forest of masts so dense that it blocked the view of the land entirely. There are over 200 French vessels joined by Genoese mercenaries, expert sailors from Italy who know the sea better than the French knights do, and they have lashed their ships together with heavy iron chains, creating a floating fortification, a literal wooden wall across the mouth of the harbour. It is a terrifying sight, a city of hostile timber floating on the tide, manned by 19,000 soldiers who are banging their shields and blowing trumpets, a cacophony intended to curdle the blood of the English sailors. But Edward does not panic. In fact, he does something that reveals the cold, calculating, tactical mind hiding behind his chivalric image. He waits. The French commanders, seeing the English fleet pause, likely jeer and mock, thinking the islanders have lost their nerve, but Edward is watching the sky and the water. He knows that in a naval battle of this era, the sun and the tide are weapons just as deadly as swords. He waits until the afternoon, until the sun begins its descent into the west, meaning it will be shining directly into the eyes of the French crossbowmen, while his own archers remain in the shade. He also waits for the tide to turn, so the current will carry his heavy ships into the enemy without the need for exhausting rowing. It is a moment of stillness before the storm, the gentle lapping of waves against the hull, betraying nothing of the violence to come. Then the order is given. The English fleet, carried by the invisible hand of the tide, drifts ominously toward the French wall. Medieval naval warfare is a strange claustrophobic affair. There are no cannons yet to blast ships apart from a distance. A sea battle in 1840 is essentially a land battle that happens to be taking place on wet, slippery wood. The ships crash together with the groan of splintering oak. Grappling hooks are thrown like iron claws to bind the vessels. And suddenly, the English Channel becomes a floating battlefield. The first sound, however, is not the clash of steel, but the terrifying hum of the yew-bow. The English longbowmen, stationed high in the top castles, platforms on the masts, begin to rain arrows down upon the French decks. It is a massacre from above. The Genoese crossbowmen, for all their skill, cannot match the rate of fire of the English longbow. While a crossbowman is winding his crank to reload, an English archer has already loosed 3 arrows, creating a rhythmic, deadly hail that pins the French defenders to their own decks. The French decision to chain their ships together, intended to create an unbreakable wall, now becomes a fatal trap. They cannot maneuver, they cannot escape. They are sitting ducks in a barrel made of their own ambition. The fighting is brutal and intimate. Men in heavy plate armour grapple on the rocking decks, slipping on blood and seawater, and to fall overboard in full armour is a death sentence, a silent plunge into the dark, murky depths from which there is no return. One of the most poignant ironies of the battle involves a ship called the Christopher. It was once Edward III's personal flagship, a beautiful vessel that had been captured by the French in a previous skirmish. Seeing his own beloved ship flying the French flag fills Edward with a cold rage, and the English fight with a particular ferocity to reclaim it. When they finally board the Christopher, clearing its decks and hoisting the English banner once more, a roar goes up that reportedly drowns out the sound of the trumpets. It is a symbolic victory within the greater slaughter. As the sun sets, turning the waters of the Sly's inlet into a shimmering crimson mirror, the French fleet is utterly destroyed. It is a catastrophe for France, a loss so total that it effectively secures the English Channel for the rest of the war, meaning that for the next century the war will be fought on French soil, with English villages remaining safe from invasion. The casualty numbers are staggering, with thousands of French sailors and knights perishing in the water or under the arrow storm. There is a famous story, perhaps apocryphal, but filled with the dark humour of the time, that tells of the French court jester being the only one brave enough to tell King Philip VI about the disaster. He allegedly walked into the royal chamber and started muttering, "Those cowardly English, those cowardly English." When the king asked why he called them cowards, the jester replied, "Because they did not jump into the sea, like our brave Frenchmen did." It is a punchline with a graveyard chill. As night falls over the wreckage, the fires of burning ships reflect in the calm water, and the English soldiers, exhausted and adrenaline sick, slump against the bulwarks of their ships. The silence slowly returns, broken only by the crackle of burning timber and the cries of seagulls descending for a feast. Edward has won his first great victory, proving that his claim to the throne is backed by iron and divine favour. He sits in his cabin, writing a letter to his son back in England, detailing the triumph, his hand perhaps shaking slightly from the fatigue of combat. The she-wolf in England will read it and smile. But this is only the beginning. The sea has been conquered, but the vast rolling fields of France still lie ahead, waiting to soak up more blood. The war has moved from the water to the land, and the nature of the conflict is about to shift from the chaotic brawls of ships to the strategic chess matches of sieges and skirmishes. We float away from the smoking ruins of Sly's, leaving the fish to their grim banquet, and drift southward toward the rugged, wind-swept peninsula of Brittany, where the next chapter of our story unfolds, not with kings, but with two women who will turn a dynastic dispute into a legendary feud. The moon rises high over the channel, a pale witness to the wreckage below, and the tide that brought the English to victory now quietly washes the debris out to the open sea, scrubbing the slate clean for the next horror. We leave the wreckage-strewn waters of the channel and drift southwest, carried by the prevailing winds, to a land that feels altogether different from the rolling green fields of England or the manicured vineyards of France. This is Brittany, a peninsula of granite and gorse, jutting out into the Atlantic like a defiant fist. The air here tastes of salt spray and ancient magic. The mists cling to the menhirs, those standing stones left by forgotten ancestors, and the people speak a Celtic tongue that sounds more like Welsh than French. It is a land of legends, where the line between history and myth is as blurred as the horizon on a foggy morning. In 1341, this rugged duchy becomes the stage for one of the most remarkable and unusual chapters of the 100 Years' War, a conflict within a conflict known as the War of the Breton Succession, But history, with a touch of poetic justice, has given it another name, the War of the Two Joans. It begins, as so many of these tragedies do, with a death. Duke John III of Brittany dies without an heir, and because medieval succession laws are about as clear and easy to navigate as a bramble thicket in the dark, two rivals step forward to claim the ducal coronet. On one side is Charles of Blois, the nephew of the French king Philip VI, representing the French connection. On the other is John of Montfort, who quickly pledges allegiance to Edward III of England, turning a local family squabble into a proxy war between the two great powers. But here is the twist that makes this story so compelling. Very early in the fighting, the men are removed from the board. John of Montfort is captured by the French and thrown into a dungeon in the Louvre, while Charles of Blois is often bogged down in the slow, grinding machinery of sieges. In a standard medieval narrative, this is where the war would pause. The men are gone. The swords should be sheathed, but the chroniclers of the time were shocked to find that the wives of these men had no intention of surrendering. The two women, both named Joan, step out from the shadows of their husbands to lead armies, command garrisons, and dictate strategy. On the French side is Jeanne of Penthièvre, a woman of sharp intellect and fierce pride, who famously declared that she would not yield an inch of her heritage, pushing her husband Charles to fight when his own resolve wavered. But it is her rival, Joanna of Flanders, the wife of the imprisoned John of Montfort, who truly captures the imagination of the age. When news arrives that her husband has been taken captive, Joanna does not weep or retire to a convent. Instead, she picks up a sword. The chronicler Jean Froissart, who was often sceptical of women in power, could not help but admire her, describing her as having the heart of a lion. Picture the scene at the town of Hennebon, a fortified port on the southern coast of Brittany. It is 1342, and the forces of Charles of Blois have surrounded the walls. Inside, Joanna of Flanders is trapped with her garrison. The situation is dire. The French siege engines are pounding the stone walls day and night, the rhythmic thud of catapults acting like a slow, terrifying heartbeat. Food is running low, and the bishop of the town is whispering about surrender, his nerve broken by the constant assault. But Joanna is everywhere at once, climbing the battlements in full armour, urging her soldiers to hold the line, and staring out at the empty grey sea, praying for the English sails that her husband's ally, Edward III, had promised. Then comes the moment that earns her the name Jeanne la Flamme, Joanna the Flame. One afternoon, while the French army is distracted, focusing all their attention on a massive assault against the main gate, Joanna notices something vital. Their rear camp, a sprawling city of tents and supply wagons, is virtually unguarded. It is a mistake born of arrogance. The French commanders simply do not believe a woman would dare to leave the safety of the walls. They are wrong. Quietly, Joanna gathers 300 of her best horsemen. The gate creaks open just enough to let them slip out, not with a roar, but with the hush of ghosts. They ride hard, skirting the edge of the forest, circling behind the enemy lines. With the sun high and the French distracted by the clash of steel at the walls, Joanna and her knights descend upon the undefended camp. Torches are thrown into the dry canvas tents, and within moments the camp is an inferno. The fire spreads with terrifying speed, devouring supplies, weapons, and pavilions. The smoke rises in a black pillar, visible for miles, and panic ripples through the French army at the walls. "Betrayal!" they cry, thinking a new army has arrived to flank them. In the chaos, the assault on the town crumbles. Joanna, cut off from the return path to the gate by the confused French troops, does not panic. Instead of trying to force her way back in, she leads her riders to a nearby castle, finding refuge only to return a few days later with reinforcements to break the siege completely. It is a sequence straight out of an action movie, yet it is recorded in the ink of the 14th century. Historians still argue about the precise details of these events. Did she personally throw the torch, or was it a command given from the saddle? Some scholars suggest that the chronicles were embellished to shame the Frenchmen for losing to a woman, using her bravery as a rhetorical device. But the core truth remains. Joanna of Flanders held the line when everything seemed lost. Back in Hennebont, however, the relief is temporary. The French regroup, and the siege tightens again. The bishop returns to his murmurs of surrender, and this time the garrison is listening. Joanna begs for just 3 more days. She climbs to the highest tower of the castle, her eyes straining against the horizon where the grey sky meets the grey sea. 1 day passes, 2 days. The council of the town is gathering to sign the capitulation. And then, on the morning of the 3rd day, a speck appears on the water, then another and another. The horizon fills with the canvas blossoms of English sails. "The English! The English!" she cries from the tower. It is Sir Walter Morney, one of Edward the Thirst's most trusted captains, arriving with a fleet of archers and men-at-arms. The town is saved, the French are driven back, and the Montfort cause lives to fight another day. It is a cinematic rescue. The timing so perfect it feels scripted, but in the slow-moving world of medieval warfare, where messages travelled at the speed of a horse and armies at the speed of a walk, such moments of convergence were often the difference between life and death. The War of the Two Joans drags on for years, a brutal stalemate that ravages the Breton countryside. It becomes a training ground for the English commanders, a place where they learn the art of the chevauchée, fast, destructive raids intended to break the enemy's economic will, and where the long bowmen refine their deadly trade. The conflict in Brittany is messy, personal, and bitter, a civil war fueled by the gold of foreign kings. While the two Joans eventually fade from the front lines, Joanna of Flanders, tragically, is said to have suffered a mental collapse later in life and was confined in England. Their legacy remains etched in the granite of Brittany. They proved that in the game of crowns the Queen is often the most dangerous piece on the board. As the mists of Brittany swirl and close over the burning tents of Hennebont, we leave the stalemate of the peninsula and move forward in time to the year 1346. The skirmishes and proxy wars are over. Edward III has decided that it is time for another direct strike, a campaign that will lead to one of the most famous days in military history. The English army is marching east, moving through the lush countryside of northern France, a walking city of iron and leather, moving toward a destiny that awaits them on a hillside near a village called Crécy. The sky is darkening, not with night, but with storm clouds that promise thunder, both from the heavens and from the earth. The age of the night is about to meet its nemesis, and the sound of it will be the snap of a bowstring. The air hangs heavy and humid over the rolling countryside of northern France, the kind of stifling, electric atmosphere that precedes a summer cloudburst, where the insects buzz with frantic energy, and the leaves turn their pale undersides to the wind. It is Saturday, the 26th of August, 1346, and we are standing on a gentle ridge near the small village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. Below us, the golden fields of wheat are about to be trampled into mud, for King Edward III has stopped running. For weeks, the English army has been moving across France, burning and looting in a grand chevauchée. But now, with his back to the forest of Crécy and the sea not far beyond, Edward has decided to turn and face the massive French host that has been hunting him. He arranges his men with the precision of a master gardener laying out a bed of thorns. He does something revolutionary for the time. He orders his knights to get off their horses. In the chivalric mindset of the 14th century, a knight without a horse is like a bird without wings, a contradiction in terms. But Edward knows that a solid wall of ironclad men standing shoulder to shoulder is harder to break than a line of skittish destriers. Flanking these dismounted knights, arranged in a jagged sawtooth formation that creates deadly crossfire zones, are the yeoman archers of England and Wales. They are not noble. They are farmers, foresters, and village ruffians, men with calloused hands and strong backs, holding yew staves that are taller than they are. They are the new weapon of mass destruction, though the French, led by King Philip VI, do not yet respect them. To the French aristocracy, this motley collection of peasants is an annoyance, a rabble to be ridden down by the glorious charge of the nobility. As the afternoon wears on, the sky begins to bruise with dark purple clouds, and a sudden, violent thunderstorm breaks over the field. It is a dramatic curtain raiser, soaking the ground and turning the dust to slick clay. There is a persistent legend, one you might have heard in school, that this rain ruined the strings of the Genoese crossbowmen fighting for the French, causing their weapons to lose power, while the English archers cleverly unstrung their bows and tucked the strings under their helmets to keep them dry. However, military historians today largely debate this. Many argue that a good crossbow string, treated with beeswax, would not have been rendered useless by a brief shower. The real difference was likely not the rain, but the mechanics. A crossbow is a powerful weapon, capable of punching through armour, but it is slow. It requires a mechanical crank or a stirrup to reload. A longbowman, trained since childhood to pull a draw weight of over 100 pounds, can loose 10 to 12 arrows in a minute. It is the difference between a sniper rifle and a machine gun. As the storm passes and the sun bursts out from beneath the clouds, shining with cruel luck directly into the eyes of the French, the battle begins. The Genoese mercenaries are ordered forward. They are tired, having marched all day with their heavy gear, and they have left their pavises, the large wooden shields they usually hide behind, back in the baggage train. They advance, shouting to intimidate the English, but the English line stands silent as stone. Then, at the signal, the longbows rise. The chronicler Jean Froissart describes what happens next with a chilling phrase: "The arrows fell like snow. It is a whiteout of death." The Genoese, unprotected and outgunned, begin to waver and retreat. And this is where the tragedy of French chivalry reveals itself. King Philip VI and his counts, seeing the mercenaries retreat, do not see a tactical withdrawal. They see cowardice. They see peasants clogging the field where noble horses should be running. In a fit of aristocratic rage, the order is given, "Kill this rabble who block our way." The French knights lower their lances and charge through their own allies, trampling the Genoese into the mud in their eagerness to get to the English. It is a horrific, chaotic crush, a traffic jam of steel and flesh. And all the while, the English arrows keep falling. The bodkin points, narrow and hardened, are designed to find the gaps in plate and pierce through mail. The French charge is not a single wave, but a series of disjointed, desperate surges. Some sources say they charged 15 times, others say 16. Each time they are funneled by the terrain and the arrow storm into a killing zone, a wall of dead horses and fallen men that grows higher with every hour. In the centre of the English line, the 16-year-old Edward of Woodstock, later known as the Black Prince, is commanding the vanguard. He is in the thick of the fighting, his armour dented, his sword red. At one point he is beaten to his knees, and a messenger rushes to his father, the king, who is watching from a windmill on the ridge, asking for reinforcements. Edward III asks, "Is my son dead or unhorsed?" When the messenger says no, the king replies with one of the most famous lines in medieval history, "Then let the boy win his spurs." It sounds harsh to modern ears, a father leaving his teenage son to potentially die, but in the context of the time it was the ultimate vote of confidence, a declaration that the prince was a warrior who needed no hand-holding. The battle rages into the evening, the screams of men and horses mingling with the hiss of arrows. Among the French ranks is a figure who embodies the dying ideal of chivalry, King John of Bohemia. He is old and completely blind, yet he refuses to miss the battle. He orders his knights to tie their horses' reins to his, so they can guide him into the fight, so he can strike at least one blow. They ride into the melee together, a chain of loyalty bound for destruction. The next morning, they are found still tied together, all dead, with the blind king in the centre. It is a moment of heartbreaking romanticism in a battle defined by cold, industrial efficiency. As night finally falls, the French army is not just defeated, it is annihilated. The flower of French nobility lies dead in the mud of Crécy. King Philip VI flees with a tiny entourage, riding through the dark to a nearby castle, banging on the gate and crying, "Open! It is the fortune of France!" The English light fires on the ridge, but there is no cheering, only the exhausted silence of men who have survived a slaughter. They remain in their positions, sleeping on the ground among the carnage, because discipline is what saved them, and discipline is what they keep. The Battle of Crécy sends a shockwave through Europe. The invincible image of the mounted knight, the tank of the Middle Ages, has been shattered by commoners with wooden sticks. The social order has been bruised. If a peasant can kill a duke from 200 yards away, what does that mean for the hierarchy of the world? It is a question that will haunt the nobility for the rest of the war. But for Edward III, there is no time for philosophy. He has won the field, but he has not won the war. He needs a port, a gateway into France that he can hold forever. He turns his army north, toward the coast, toward a city that will become the obsession of the next year. The arrows have darkened the sky and cleared the path, but the walls of Calais are high, and the people inside are stubborn. We leave the silent, crow-haunted fields of Crécy behind, the air still thick with the metallic scent of blood, and march with the victorious, weary English toward the sea, where a siege of starvation and sacrifice awaits. From the blood-soaked ridge of Crécy, we march north toward the scent of the sea, arriving in September of 1346 at the gates of Calais, a city that stands like a stone sentinel guarding the narrowest point of the channel, where on a clear day you can see the white cliffs of Dover shimmering like a mirage on the horizon, tantalizingly close, yet utterly unreachable for the French defenders trapped within. Edward III knows that taking this city is not a matter of hours or days, but of patience, for Calais is built on marshes and surrounded by double walls and wet moats that make a direct assault suicidal. So, instead of battering the walls, Edward decides to strangle them. He orders his army to build a new city outside the old one, a sprawling settlement of timber houses, marketplaces, and thatched halls that the soldiers ironically call Villeneuve-la-Hardie, or Brave New Town. It is a surreal juxtaposition. While the people inside Calais are beginning to count their grain kernels and ration their water, the English outside are holding tournaments, trading with Flemish merchants, and sleeping in beds, waiting for the invisible hand of hunger to do the work that swords cannot. The siege drags on through the autumn storms and into the biting cold of winter, a slow-motion tragedy played out against the grey backdrop of the sea. Inside the walls, the governor of Calais, a man of iron will named Jean de Vienne, realizes that the food will not last, and he makes a decision that haunts the history of this war, a moment where the cruelty of survival logic overrides the human heart. He orders the expulsion of the useless mouths, the bouches inutiles, the elderly, the sick, the women, and the children who cannot fight, but still need to eat. The gates open, and hundreds of these wretched souls are pushed out into the no-man's land between the city walls and the English camp. Here, history fractures into two different stories, and historians still argue over which is the truth. The chronicler Jean Froissart, who often wrote to please his noble patrons, claims that Edward III took pity on them, feeding them bread and giving them a few coins before sending them on their way. But other sources, darker and perhaps more honest, tell us that the English refused to let them pass, trapping them in the freezing ditch between the two armies to die of exposure and starvation, while their families watched from the walls. It is a ghost story that lingers in the marshes around Calais to this day, a reminder that in war the greatest suffering often falls upon those who hold no weapons. As spring arrives, bringing no relief, the French King Philip VI finally marches north with a massive army to lift the siege, and the hearts of the defenders soar with hope, seeing the banners of France fluttering on the hills. But it is a false dawn. Philip finds the English positions too strong, the marshlands too treacherous to cross, and after a few days of posturing, he turns his army around and marches away, abandoning Calais to its fate. The silence that falls over the city when the French banners disappear is heavier than any bombardment. Jean de Vienne goes to the battlements and signals surrender, but Edward is in no mood for mercy. He has lost time, money, and men to the stubbornness of this city, and he demands unconditional capitulation, threatening to put every soul to the sword. It is here that we witness one of the most famous and emotionally resonant scenes of the Middle Ages, a moment that feels like a play written for the stage but was acted out in the grit of reality. Edward agrees to spare the populace on one condition. 6 of the city's most prominent citizens, the burghers, must walk out of the gates bareheaded and barefoot, wearing only their shirts with heavy ropes around their necks and the keys to the city and castle in their hands, surrendering themselves to be executed in place of the people. It is a theatre of humiliation and sacrifice. Eustache de Saint-Pierre, the wealthiest man in Calais, is the first to volunteer, stepping forward into the cold air, followed by 5 others. Imagine the sound of their bare feet on the cobblestones, the weight of the rough hemp ropes scratching their necks, the heavy iron keys clanking softly as they walk through the lines of silent English soldiers. They kneel before Edward III, who calls for the executioner, his face set in stone, ignoring the pleas of his own knights who beg him not to stain his honour with such cruelty. The axe is ready, the mood is grim, and the air is thick with the tension of imminent death. But then, a figure moves through the crowd. Queen Philippa of Hainaut, Edward's heavily pregnant wife. She falls to her knees before her husband, weeping, and speaks words that have echoed through the centuries. "Ah, gentle sir, since I have crossed the sea in great peril to see you, I have never asked you for anything. Now I humbly pray, for the sake of the Son of the Holy Mary and for your love of me, that you will have mercy on these 6 men." The king stares at her, the silence stretching out, the tension vibrating like a plucked string. He looks at the weeping burghers, he looks at his knights, and finally he looks at his wife, whose belly carries the future of his dynasty. His anger breaks. "Lady," he says, "I wish you were anywhere else but here. You entreat in such a manner that I cannot refuse you. I give them to you. Do with them as you please." It is a moment of profound humanity amidst the inhumanity of siege warfare, a reminder that even kings are subject to the soft power of love and shame. Philippa takes the men, feeds them, clothes them, and sends them away safely. Calais is now English, and it will remain an English possession for over 200 years, a bustling hub of the wool trade and a thorn in the side of France, inscribed with the phrase, "the brightest jewel in the English crown." The inhabitants are expelled, replaced by English settlers, turning Calais into a little England on the continent, a place of English ale and English law. Edward has achieved his foothold. He has humiliated the French king and secured his gateway. The war seems poised to escalate further, with English armies ready to surge deep into the heart of France. But as the victorious soldiers settle into their new homes in Calais and the ships sail back and forth across the secure channel, something else is travelling with them, something far more deadly than any arrow or sword. It is a stowaway that hides in the fur of rats and the bellies of fleas, a microscopic passenger that has travelled the Silk Road from the distant steppes of the East. It does not care for kings or borders, for the House of Plantagenet or the House of Valois. It is the great mortality, the Black Death, and it is about to draw a curtain of silence across the war, turning the battlefields into graveyards where no trumpet sounds. The armies will stop, not because of a truce, but because there will be no one left to hold the spears. As we leave the wind-swept ramparts of Calais, we can feel the air growing colder, a supernatural chill that has nothing to do with the weather, as the shadow of the plague begins to creep over Europe, silencing the ambitions of men with the terrible equality of the grave. The swords are sheathed, not by the command of kings, but by the trembling hand of fate, and we find ourselves in the year 1348, drifting through a world that has suddenly grown terrifyingly quiet. The clash of steel and the roar of the battlefield have been replaced by a silence so heavy it feels like a physical weight pressing down on the chest of Europe, a hush broken only by the creaking of carts and the tolling of church bells that ring with a monotonous, exhausting regularity until, eventually, even the bell ringers are gone and the steeples fall silent too. We have entered the era of the great mortality, known to later generations as the Black Death, an interlude in the 100 Years' War, where the primary antagonist is no longer a French knight or an English archer, but a microscopic bacterium named Yersinia pestis, hitchhiking in the gut of a flea, hidden in the fur of a rat, scurrying down a mooring rope in a harbour. It arrives like a dark mist, rolling in from the east, carried on the very trade ships that brought silk and spices to the wealthy courts of Paris and London. It enters through the port of Marseille, climbing up the Rhone Valley like a flood, and it lands on the shores of England at Melcombe Regis in Dorset, brought, some say, by a sailor who arrived with a fever and a pocket full of coin, unaware that he was patient zero for a catastrophe that would hollow out the kingdom. The war, which had seemed so all-consuming just months before, suddenly becomes trivial, a petty squabble between children while the house is burning down. Edward III and Philip VI are forced to agree to a truce, not out of diplomacy, but out of sheer biological necessity. You cannot levy an army when the tax collectors are dead in the roadside ditches, and the young men who would hold the spears are writhing in fevered delirium. The plague does not respect rank or heraldry. It steps through the velvet curtains of the royal palaces just as easily as it pushes through the rough timber doors of a peasant's hut. One of the most heartbreaking stories of this time, a historical truth that feels like a grim fairy tale, concerns King Edward III's beloved daughter, Princess Joan. She is just 14, a golden child of the Plantagenet line, betrothed to Pedro of Castile in a political marriage meant to secure an alliance with Spain. She travels south with a magnificent entourage, her wagons laden with wedding finery, including a dress made of cloth of gold so stiff and rich it can stand on its own. But when she reaches Bordeaux, the sickness is already there waiting for her. The air in the city is thick with the scent of aromatic herbs burned in desperate attempts to purify the miasma, the bad air that medieval doctors believed caused the disease. Joan is moved to a small village for safety, but the invisible enemy finds her. She dies not in a bridal bed, but in a fever, and instead of a wedding feast, her entourage brings back a corpse. Edward III, usually a man of iron stoicism, writes a letter to the Spanish royal family that reveals a rare glimpse of his shattered heart, saying, "We have sent an angel to heaven. It is a reminder that behind the politics and the armour, these are fathers and mothers, watching their world dissolve." The medical knowledge of the time is tragically helpless against this onslaught. Learned doctors from the University of Paris gaze at the stars and blame a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, while village healers suggest pressing a plucked chicken against the buboes or bathing in vinegar. There's a dark, absurd humour in the remedies. One text earnestly suggests that flatulence stored in a jar might help purify the air, a desperate and slightly hilarious grasp at straws in a drowning world. But the reality is a nightmare. In the villages of France and England, the social fabric begins to unravel. The crops stand rotting in the fields because there is no one to harvest them. The sheep wander aimlessly, bloating with wool that no one will shear. The feudal system, which relies on a vast base of peasant labour to support the pyramid of nobility, faces an existential crisis. Historians still argue intensely about the long-term effects of this demographic collapse. Some suggest it was the golden age of the peasant, because suddenly labour was scarce and valuable. A survivor who could hold a plough could demand wages that would have been unthinkable a few years prior, forcing the lords to pay up or starve. The survivors look at the world differently. Having stared into the abyss, they are less afraid of their earthly masters. Art begins to change, filling with images of the danse macabre, the dance of death, where skeletons lead kings, popes and peasants alike in a jig to the grave, a visual reminder that death is the great equalizer. The war, though paused, is not forgotten, but it simmers on a low heat. Small bands of mercenaries, unemployed and terrified, turn to brigandage, roaming the empty countryside like packs of wolves, taking what they want from the few who remain. This period is a twilight zone, a hollow breath between the screams of battle, where the population of Europe is reduced by perhaps a third or even half. Imagine walking down your street and erasing every second person you see, and you begin to understand the scale of the trauma. Yet, humanity is resilient, stubbornly so. As the years of the worst outbreaks pass, roughly around 1351, the survivors begin to emerge from their shuttered homes. They blink in the sunlight, looking at the empty lands that now belong to them. The truces expire. The kings, having mourned their dead and secured their own survival, feel the itch of ambition returning. The truce of God, imposed by the plague, lifts, and the machinery of conflict begins to creak back into motion, though it is a different machine now, rustier, perhaps, and manned by fewer hands. Philip the Sixth of France, the man who lost his fleet at Sluys and his army at Crécy, dies in 1350, not on the battlefield, but in his bed, passing the poisoned chalice of the French crown to his son, John II, known as John the Good. Good, in medieval monikers, often implies generous or chivalrous, rather than competent, and poor King John will need more than generosity to face what is coming. Edward III is still there, older, harder, his eyes fixed on the prize that slipped through his fingers before the sickness came. The pause button is released. The grey clouds of the plague years begin to drift apart, revealing a landscape that is underpopulated, overgrown, and ripe for the plucking. For the silence that held the world captive is broken by the sound of a blacksmith's hammer hitting an anvil, forging a new sword for a new generation of soldiers who have survived the wrath of God and are now ready to face the wrath of men. We leave the mass graves and the weeping processions behind, moving forward into a world that feels slightly emptier, echoing with the ghosts of the unburied, as the English army prepares to launch a new kind of raid, a deep, destructive thrust into the heart of France, led by a man who wears black armour and carries a reputation as dark and terrifying as the plague itself. The Black Prince is ready to ride, and the harvest he seeks is not of wheat, but of gold and glory. The year is 1356, and we are moving through the lush, sun-drenched vineyards of central France, but the air does not smell of ripening grapes, it smells of smoke. A shadow is moving across the land, a column of men and horses stretching for miles, laden with silver chalices, silk tapestries, and barrels of stolen wine. At the head of this army rides a figure who has become a living nightmare for the French population, Edward of Woodstock, the Prince of Wales, known to history as the Black Prince. He is 26 years old, a warrior, in his prime, and while there is no contemporary evidence that he actually wore black armour, that vivid image was likely an invention of later storytellers. His reputation is certainly dark enough to earn the name. He has been conducting a chevauchée on a massive scale, a brutal raid designed not to conquer territory, but to burn the economic heart out of France, proving to the people that their new king, John II, cannot protect them. The English army is moving slowly, heavy with loot, like a gorged predator trying to make its way back to its lair in Bordeaux, but they have lingered too long. King John II, eager to prove he is not the hesitant leader his father was, has raised a massive host, manoeuvring with surprising speed to cut off the English retreat. Near the city of Poitiers, the trap snaps shut. The Black Prince finds his path blocked by a French army that outnumbers him significantly, perhaps 2 to 1, though medieval numbers are notoriously slippery. Realizing he is cornered, the prince offers generous terms. He will return all the loot, release his prisoners, and promise not to fight against France for 7 years. It is a humiliating offer, a sign of desperation, but King John, surrounded by his confident nobles who are itching to wash away the stain of Crécy, refuses. He demands the prince surrender himself as a hostage. The answer, of course, is a polite but firm gripping of sword hilts. The battle is inevitable. We find ourselves on a Monday morning, the 19th of September. The English have taken up a defensive position on a slope near the woods of Noailles-Maupertuis, using the terrain with the same cunning they displayed at Crécy. They are protected by thick hedges and vineyards, forcing the enemy to attack through narrow choke points. But the French have learned, or so they think, from their past disasters. King John orders his knights to send their horses to the rear. He believes that if his men fight on foot, they will not be vulnerable to the chaos of panicked horses falling to English arrows. It is a logical decision, but it leads to a tragic irony. The French knights, encased in the latest, heaviest plate armour, are now forced to march uphill through mud and tangled vines under a scorching sun. They are exhausted before they even swing a sword. The battle opens with a tentative French cavalry charge intended to clear the English archers, but the arrows fly, the horses scream, and the attack shatters against the hedges. Then comes the main body of the French army, a wall of steel trudging up the slope. The fighting is brutal and claustrophobic. The English archers, running low on arrows, are said to have run out into the field to pull bolts from dead bodies, or even thrown stones, fighting with a desperate savagery. The Black Prince, seeing the French line waver, makes a bold gamble. He orders a detachment of cavalry, led by the Gascon noble, the Captal de Buch, to swing wide and strike the French rear. It is the hammer blow. Caught between the English shield wall and the cavalry at their backs, the French formation collapses. Panic, that infectious disease of armies, spreads like wildfire. Nobles begin to flee, calling for their horses, abandoning their king. But King John II does not run, and this is where the story shifts from a tactical analysis to a human tragedy. The King of France, dressed in his royal surcoat with the golden lilies, stands his ground, wielding a heavy battle-axe mace. He is fighting not just for his life, but for the honour of a monarchy that is crumbling around him. Beside him stands his youngest son, Philip, a boy of only 14. The image is searing. The hulking king swinging his axe, smashing down English soldiers, while the young boy, too small to turn the tide but too brave to leave his father, calls out warnings. "Father, guard to the right. Father, guard to the left." It is a moment of intimacy in the centre of a slaughter, a father and son back to back against the world. But there are too many enemies. The English and Gascon soldiers swarm around them, recognizing the king, shouting "Surrender!" in a cacophony of French and English dialects. They are grabbing at his armour, arguing over who gets the credit and the ransom for capturing the monarch. Finally, a French knight exiled in the English service pushes through the mob and asks the king to yield. John takes off his gauntlet and hands it over. The fighting stops. The King of France is a prisoner. That evening, in the red glow of the campfires, a scene plays out that embodies the strange contradictions of chivalry. The Black Book Prince hosts a banquet for his royal captive. He does not sit at the table. Instead, he personally serves King John, waiting on him with food and wine, bowing and offering words of comfort, praising the king's supreme bravery, and stating that he had won the prize of valour that day, even if he lost the battle. It is a surreal display of respect, a reminder that to these men, class often matters more than nationality. They are fellow members of the exclusive club of nobility, even if they just tried to kill each other. But while the wine flows in the English camp, the reality for France is catastrophic. The news ripples out from Poitiers like a shockwave. The king is gone. The army is destroyed. The nobles who fled are branded as cowards, spat upon in the streets by their own subjects. France is effectively a decapitated body, twitching in the dirt. There is no strong hand to hold the reins of state. The Dauphin, the king's eldest son, is left to manage the chaos, but he is young and untested. The capture of King John is not just a military defeat, it is a political earthquake. The ransom demanded by the English is astronomical, equal to twice the annual income of the entire French kingdom. To pay it, taxes must be raised on a population that is already starving, plague-ridden, and war-weary. The social contract, the ancient deal where the nobility protects the people in exchange for their labour, has been broken. The knights failed to protect the king, they failed to protect the kingdom, and now they want the peasants to pay for their failure. As the Black Prince marches his royal prize back to Bordeaux and then to London, where King John will be housed in luxury at the Savoy Palace, the silence in the French countryside begins to change. It is no longer the silence of fear. It is a low, angry rumble, like the grinding of millstones. The wolves are coming out of the forest, but this time the wolves are men with pitchforks and nothing left to lose. The tragedy of Poitiers has set the stage for a horror that will make the battlefield look like a tournament. We turn our gaze now from the glittering tents of the victors to the mud-walled huts of the vanquished, where a fire is being kindled that will burn the castles of the north. The year is 1358, and the wind blowing across the plains of northern France carries the acrid taste of ash. The kingdom is a house without a roof, exposed to the elements and the predators that roam in the twilight of the state's collapse. With King John II playing chess in a gilded cage in London and the French army scattered to the winds, a new horror has descended upon the peasantry, a plague not of bacteria, but of men. They are called the routiers, or free companies, bands of demobilized soldiers, English, Welsh, Gascon, and even French, who have found themselves unemployed by the truce. Instead of returning to their ploughs, they have decided that war is a lifestyle, not a job. They roam the countryside like packs of feral dogs, seizing castles, burning villages, and holding entire towns for ransom. It is a time of might makes right, where the only law is the sword. But for the peasants, the ones who toil in the mud to grow the wheat that feeds the knights, the breaking point has finally arrived. They have watched their lords, the class of men sworn to protect them, flee from the field of Poitiers like startled deer. They have been taxed into starvation to pay for the ransoms of these same cowardly nobles, and now they are being eaten alive by brigands while the aristocracy hides behind the high walls of Paris. The social contract, that ancient invisible thread binding the three estates of medieval society, snaps with a sound like a cracking whip. It begins In the Oise Valley, north of Paris, not as a planned revolution with manifestos and speeches, but as a spontaneous spasm of pure, white-hot rage. A group of peasants pushing back against a foraging party of knights kills them. It should be a minor incident, a local crime, but the spark lands in a field of dry tinder. Suddenly, the uprising spreads like a forest fire in a high wind. This is the Jacquerie. The name comes from the derogatory nickname the nobles use for the peasants, Jacques Bonhomme, or Jack Goodfellow, a term implying a simpleton, a sturdy, stupid beast of burden who exists only to carry the weight of the world. But Jack has dropped the burden and picked up a scythe. The chronicles of the time, written almost exclusively by monks and courtiers who viewed the peasants with a mixture of disgust and terror, describe the uprising as the work of demons. Jean Froissart, our ever-dramatic guide, writes of peasants engaging in acts of unspeakable savagery, roasting knights on spits and forcing their wives to eat them. Modern historians, however, suggest we take these lurid tales with a grain of salt, or perhaps a whole shaker. While there is no doubt that the violence is brutal, with castles burned and nobles killed, much of the demonic imagery was likely propaganda created later to justify the horrific slaughter that would be unleashed in response. What is true, and perhaps more terrifying to the nobility than any atrocity story, is that the peasants are beginning to organise. They find a leader in Guillaume Carle, a wealthy, articulate farmer who is not a monster, but a man trying to bring strategy to a mob. He is a tragic figure, a man of intelligence standing in the eye of a hurricane he cannot fully control. He tries to impose discipline, marching his army of Jacques under banners, attempting to ally with the rebellious townsfolk of Paris, who are also tired of the Dauphin's weak rule. For a few breathless weeks, it seems as though the world is turning upside down. The smoke of burning chateaux stains the summer sky, and the roads are clogged with terrified noble families fleeing the wrath of their own serfs. It is a moment where the terrifying realization hits the aristocracy. There are a lot more of them than there are of us. The fear is so profound that it achieves the impossible. It unites the English and the French. Knights who were trying to kill each other at Poitiers suddenly find common cause. The rivalry of nations evaporates when faced with the war of classes. It is a grimly ironic solidarity, like two rival wolves pausing their duel to crush a rebellion of the sheep. Enter Charles the Bad, the King of Navarre. He is one of the most colourful and treacherous characters of the 14th century, a man whose nickname, the Bad, was earned through a lifetime of plotting, poisoning, and side-switching. He is a cousin to the French king and holds vast lands. And seeing an opportunity to play the hero and perhaps seize more power, he leads a force of knights to meet the peasant army near the village of Mello. Guillaume Carle, knowing his army of pitchfork-wielding farmers cannot stand against armoured cavalry in an open field, arranges his men in a strong defensive position, a wagon fort on a hill. It is a smart move. Charles the Bad, seeing that a direct charge would be costly, reverts to his nature. He cheats. He invites Guillaume Carle to a parley, a diplomatic talk to discuss a truce. Carle, perhaps believing that the code of chivalry extends to him, or perhaps just desperate to avoid a massacre, agrees. He walks into the noble camp alone, unarmed. But chivalry is a game played only between equals. To the knights, Carle is not a general. He is a runaway dog. The moment he enters the tent, he is seized. The leaderless peasant army, watching from the hill, falls into confusion. Seeing the head cut off the snake, the knights charge. What follows is not a battle. It is a harvest. The peasants are ridden down, scattered, and butchered in the thousands. The fields of Mello turn red. The retribution does not end there. For weeks, the nobility rides through the countryside in a campaign of terror, hanging Jacques from every available tree, burning villages that may or may not have been involved, sending a message written in blood that the social order is not to be touched. As for Guillaume Carle, his end is the stuff of nightmares. The chroniclers say that Charles the Bad, with a cruel wit, crowned him the king of the peasants, placing a red-hot iron trivet, or perhaps a glowing iron crown, onto his head before executing him. The Jacquerie is crushed as quickly as it began, leaving behind a scarred landscape and a deep festering resentment that will sleep in the soil of France for centuries, waiting for a distant year like 1789 to wake up again. The wolves have reasserted their dominance, but the fear remains in their eyes. They have seen the impossible. They have seen the sheep bite. The war between England and France can now resume, for the internal matter has been settled. The English captains, who had paused to help crush the revolt, returned to their business of plunder. The Dauphin, emerging from the chaos, looks out over a kingdom that is charred, depopulated and traumatized. But in the midst of this darkness there is a strange flickering light of hope, or perhaps just exhaustion. The sheer scale of the misery, the plague, the war and the revolt forces everyone to the negotiating table. The English are rich with loot but tired. The French are desperate to get their king back. We are moving toward a moment of pause, a treaty that promises to redraw the map of Europe. We leave the smoking ruins of the peasant villages, where the silence of the grave has returned, and travel to the town of Bretigny, where the quill will try to fix what the sword has broken. The ink is being mixed, the wax is being melted, and the map-makers are sharpening their tools, ready to carve up a kingdom as if it were a roast pheasant at a banquet. The year is 1359, and the road to peace is paved with mud, frozen ruts, and the shattered ambitions of a king who thought he had already won. Edward III, frustrated that the French government, even with its king in captivity, refuses to capitulate entirely, decides to play his final card. He launches what is meant to be the coronation campaign. He packs his great seal, his crown, and an army of over 10,000 men, crossing the channel not to raid, but to conquer. His target is the holy city of Reims, the place where French kings are anointed with the sacred oil of Clovis. Edward intends to march there, force the city to open its gates, and have himself crowned King of France in the very cathedral that validates the monarchy. It is a plan of supreme confidence, bordering on arrogance, but history has a way of humbling the proud, and this time the weapon used against the English is not a sword, but the weather. The winter of 1359-1360 is one of the cruelest in living memory. The English army marches through a landscape that has been stripped bare by the French scorched earth tactics. There is no food to forage, no shelter to be found. The great English war machine, usually so efficient, begins to sputter in the sleet and snow. When they finally reach the walls of Reims, they find the city barricaded and defiant. The citizens have razed the buildings outside the walls to deny the English cover, and they sit tight, knowing that hunger is a better defender than any knight. Edward waits. He circles, but he cannot break in. After weeks of shivering in the open, watching his horses die of cold, he is forced to abandon the dream of a coronation. He turns his army toward Paris, trying to goad the Dauphin into battle, but the Dauphin, learning from the mistakes of Crécy and Poitiers, stays behind his walls. It is a stalemate of frustration. And then, on Easter Monday, the 13th of April, 1360, something happens that changes the course of the war. A moment where nature itself seems to intervene in the affairs of men. The English army is camped near the town of Chartres, exhausted and demoralized. The sky begins to darken, not with the usual grey of a spring shower, but with a strange, bruised purple that unnerves the horses. The temperature plunges. Suddenly the heavens open, but it is not rain that falls. It is a hailstorm of biblical proportions. The chroniclers tell us that the hailstones were as large as goose eggs, jagged blocks of ice, falling with terminal velocity from the black clouds. Lightning tears the sky apart, striking the armour of the knights, turning them into human lightning rods. Panic ensues. Horses break their tethers and stampede. Tents are shredded like paper. Soldiers, tough men who have survived the arrow storms of Crécy, are beaten to death by the ice. It is said that nearly 1,000 men and thousands of horses perish in the onslaught. It is known forever after as Black Monday. In the midst of this apocalypse, King Edward III falls to his knees in the mud, facing the Cathedral of Chartres, which is visible in the distance through the flashes of lightning. He interprets the storm as a direct sign of God's anger, a divine message that he has asked for too much, that he has pushed the suffering of France too far. There, amidst the roar of the thunder, he vows to the Virgin Mary that he will make peace. Whether it was true piety or simply the realization that his army was disintegrating, Edward keeps his word. Negotiations begin in earnest at the nearby village of Bretigny. The treaty that emerges is a masterpiece of medieval diplomacy, a document that attempts to redraw reality with ink. The terms are staggering. Edward III agrees to renounce his claim to the French throne. The very cause of the war is officially dropped. In exchange, the French concede a massive amount of territory. The English are given full sovereignty over a swollen duchy of Aquitaine, covering almost a third of France, along with Calais and other northern territories. It is no longer a feudal holding. It is an English kingdom on the continent, free from any homage to Paris. King John II is to be ransomed for 3 million gold écus, a sum so vast it is difficult to even comprehend. Imagine asking a bankrupt nation to pay off the national debt in cash. To guarantee the payment, John is allowed to return to France to raise the money, while 40 noble hostages, including his own sons, are sent to London to take his place in captivity. The Treaty of Bretigny is signed in May 1360, and for a moment the world breathes a sigh of relief. The church bells ring again. The merchants cautiously push their carts onto the roads. It seems as though the Great War is finally over. Edward goes home a conqueror, holding half of France. King John returns to a Paris that is battered but still standing. But here we find one of the most touching and baffling stories of the chivalric age, a historical truth that modern minds struggle to grasp. One of the hostages in London is John's second son, Louis of Anjou. Louis is a young man who finds life in English captivity, even though it is a comfortable courtly captivity. Rather boring, he manages to escape, breaking his parole and fleeing to France to join his young wife. By the rules of modern warfare, this is a daring feat. By the rules of 14th century chivalry, it is a disgrace. King John is horrified. He believes that a king's word is his bond, the only thing that separates a monarch from a brigand. He declares that if honour is banished from the rest of the world, it should still find a home in the hearts of kings. In a move that shocks his counsellors and seemingly defies all logic, King John announces that he will voluntarily return to captivity in England to take his son's place and fulfil the terms of the treaty. His advisers beg him to stay. His people need him. But John is adamant. In early 1364 he crosses the Channel, handing himself back over to the English. He is greeted in London with fanfare, treated not as a prisoner but as a distinguished guest, a cousin who just happens to be under lock and key. It is a tragic, noble, and perhaps foolish gesture. A few months later, John falls ill and dies in London, passing away in a foreign land, a prisoner of his own code of honour. His death leaves the French crown to his son, Charles VII, the man who had watched from the walls while the English burned the countryside. Charles V is not like his father. He is not a warrior king who yearns for the glory of the charge. He is physically frail, suffering from a mysterious illness that leaves him pale and weak, possibly tuberculosis or a severe form of gout. He cannot swing a sword, he can barely ride a horse. But he possesses something his father and grandfather lacked: a cold, brilliant, calculating intellect. He is known as Charles the Wise, and he understands that the days of chivalry are dying. He looks at the map of France, carved up by the Treaty of Bretigny, and he does not see a permanent defeat. He sees a legal document that can be picked apart, clause by clause. He sees an English occupation that is overextended and expensive. And he sees a way to win the war, not by fighting battles, but by refusing to fight them. The peace of 1360 is a mirage, a thin layer of ice over a deep, dark river. The free companies are still roaming the land, refusing to disarm, becoming a cancer that neither king can control. And in the quiet chambers of the Louvre, the new French king is reading books on law and strategy, preparing to dismantle the English victory piece by piece. The war is not over, it is merely taking a breath, changing its shape from a brawl to a chess match. The sun sets on the era of Edward III's triumphs, and the long shadows of the reconquest are beginning to stretch across the fields of Aquitaine. The year is 1364, and the winds of fortune are shifting, blowing not from the sea, but from the quiet candlelit study of the new French king, Charles IX. We are far from the mud and blood of the battlefield. Here, the air smells of parchment, dust, and the medicinal herbs the king takes for his constant ailments. Charles is a man who knows he cannot defeat the English with muscle. His arms are too thin to lift a lance, and his health is too fragile for the rigours of a campaign, so he decides to defeat them with his mind. He looks at the map of France, stained by English occupation, and he realises that the chivalric code of his ancestors was a suicide pact. The English longbowmen and the tactical genius of Edward III have turned open battles into slaughterhouses for French nobility. So Charles makes a radical decision. There will be no more battles, no more glittering charges, no more fields of honour. Instead, he will fight a war of shadows, of sieges, of sudden ambushes in the twilight. But to lead this new kind of war, he needs a new kind of general. He cannot ask a high-born duke to hide in the bushes like a common thief. He needs a wolf to hunt the wolves, and he finds him in the rugged backwoods of Brittany. Enter Bertrand du Guesclin. If you were to cast a hero for a medieval epic, you would never choose him. History remembers him as the Eagle of Brittany, but his contemporaries often called him the Black Dog of Brocéliande. He is short, squat, with a face so battered and ugly by his own admission that his own mother reportedly struggled to look at him when he was a child. He has no great lineage, no fortune, and no courtly manners. He is a brawler, a man who rose from the ranks of minor nobility by leading bands of guerrillas in the Breton swamps, but he possesses a genius for war that rivals even the Black Prince. Du Guesclin understands that the English army is a heavy, expensive machine that needs to be fed and paid. If you starve it, harass it, and refuse to give it the battle it craves, it will rust. Charles I appoints this rough-hewn soldier as the Constable of France, the highest military rank in the kingdom. It is a shock to the aristocracy, a man who looks like a bandit leading the armies of the king. But Charles V does not care about aesthetics. He cares about results. The war reignites in 1369, but it is a war the English do not recognise. The Black Prince, still ruling in Aquitaine, is baffled. He marches his great army out, looking for a fight, daring the French to meet him. But the French are gone. They melt into the forests, they retreat behind the walls of well-stocked castles. As soon as the English army passes, Du Guesclin's men emerge from the mist to cut supply lines, kill stragglers, and liberate towns that open their gates willingly. It is a strategy of frustration. The English march through empty fields, their treasury draining, their soldiers growing sick and mutinous. It is the Fabian strategy, reborn in the Middle Ages, victory by refusing to lose. However, Before the war in France fully resumes, there is a strange and dramatic detour into Spain, the Castilian Civil War, which becomes a proxy theatre for the 100 Years' War. A cruel king, Peter of Castile, Peter the Cruel, is fighting his half-brother, Henry of Trastamara. France supports Henry, England supports Peter. It leads to the Battle of Nájera in 1367, the last great victory of the Black Prince. He smashes the French and Spanish forces, capturing Du Guesclin in the process. There is a wonderful story, perhaps embellished but spiritually true, about Du Guesclin's captivity. When the prince asks him to name his ransom, Du Guesclin names a sum so astronomically high, 100,000 florins, that the prince is stunned. "Why such a price?" the prince asks. Du Guesclin grins and replies, "Because the King of France will pay half, and the King of Castile the other half, but mostly because every spinning woman in France would spin all night to earn the money to set me free." It is a testament to his status. As a folk hero, he is the people's champion, the ugly underdog who bites back. But Nájera is a Pyrrhic victory for the Black Prince. The campaign in the scorching Spanish heat ruins his health. He contracts a sickness, likely dysentery or perhaps dropsy, that will slowly kill him over the next decade. He returns to Aquitaine a broken man, his body bloated, his temper foul, his treasury empty, because Peter the Cruel refused to pay him. To recoup his losses, the prince imposes a hearth tax on his subjects in Aquitaine. It is the straw that breaks the camel's back. The Gascon lords appeal to King Charles V of France for help. Charles, seeing his enemy weakened, summons the Black Prince to Paris to answer for his conduct as a vassal. The prince, lying on his sickbed, sends a message back that chills the blood. "I will come to Paris, but it will be with a helmet on my head and 60,000 men at my back." Brave words, but hollow. When the war resumes, the prince is too sick to ride. He has to be carried on a litter. In 1370, in a fit of pain-induced rage, he orders the sack of the city of Limoges, which had turned to the French. The chroniclers describe a massacre, with the prince being carried through the burning streets, while women and children beg for mercy that does not come. It is a dark stain on his chivalric reputation, a tragic final act for the flower of English knighthood. Shortly after, he sails home to England, leaving the war behind. He will never return. With the prince gone, and Edward III drifting into the senility of old age, the English defence in France collapses. Du Guesclin is everywhere. He does not take cities by storm. He buys them, he intimidates them, he surprises them. One by one, the great gains of the Treaty of Bretigny evaporate. Poitou falls, Saintonge falls. The English are pushed back, mile by mile, until they hold only a thin strip of coast around Bordeaux and Calais. The great English empire on the continent is dissolving like sugar in hot tea. By the time Du Guesclin dies in 1380, buried, remarkably, in the royal basilica of Saint-Denis alongside the kings he served, France has been largely reclaimed. Charles V follows him to the grave just months later. The first great phase of the war is over. The giants are leaving the stage. Edward III dies in 1377, a shadow of the warrior who won Sluys, leaving the crown to his 10-year-old grandson Richard II, the son of the Black Prince. The she-wolf is long dead. The heroes of Crécy and Poitiers are dust. The English have lost almost everything they won, retaining only a few port cities and a deep burning resentment. The war has settled into a stalemate again, but the internal rot in England is beginning to smell. The cost of the failed campaigns has fallen on the shoulders of the English peasantry, and just as the French peasants rose up in the Jacquerie, The common people of England are beginning to ask why they should pay for the failures of their lords. We are moving from the forests of Brittany to the muddy streets of London, where a preacher named John Ball is asking a dangerous question. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The war abroad is quieting down, but the war at home is about to begin. The cycle of violence, having exhausted France, crosses the Channel to visit the victors. We cross the Channel now, leaving the sun-drenched, war-torn fields of France behind, and drift through the grey mists of the Thames estuary, arriving in the bustling, crowded, soot-stained city of London in the summer of 1381. The air here is thick with tension, a suffocating humidity that smells of unwashed wool, coal smoke, and brewing rebellion. The glory days of Crécy and Poitiers feel like a distant memory, a golden age that has rusted away. King Edward III is dead, buried with his victories. The Black Prince is gone. The crown now sits on the head of a boy, Richard II, who is only 14 years old, a child with the face of an angel and the terrifying power of a god. But the real power lies with his uncles, particularly John of Gaunt, a man so wealthy and unpopular that he has become the villain of every tavern rumour in the kingdom. The war in France has gone wrong. The English garrisons are shrinking. The coasts are being raided by French pirates and the treasury is empty. To fill it, the government has invented something truly hated, the poll tax. It is a blunt instrument of finance, demanding a shilling from every adult, regardless of whether they are a rich merchant or a starving ploughman. It is a tax on breathing, and for the peasantry who have survived the Black Death and know their own worth, it is the final insult. The spark ignites, not in London, but in the quiet villages of Essex and Kent. When the royal tax collectors arrive with their ledgers and their arrogance, probing into the private lives of villagers to see who hasn't paid, the people simply say no. It is a word that echoes like a thunderclap. The no turns into a shout, the shout into a riot, and within days, the entire southeast of England is on the march. They are led by men who have become legends of the working class. Wat Tyler, a man of obscure origins but charismatic authority, and John Ball, a radical priest who has been preaching a dangerous kind of gospel, that in the Garden of Eden there were no lords and no serfs. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? He asks, a question that cuts through the feudal hierarchy like a razor. This is not a disorderly mob of mindless brutes. Many of these men are village officials, constables and archers who served in France. They march with discipline, moving toward the capital like a rising tide. On the 13th of June, the feast of Corpus Christi, the great peasant army reaches London. And here, a historical truth reveals the deep divisions within the city itself. The gates are not battered down, they are opened from the inside. The poor of London, sympathising with their rural cousins, lower the drawbridge of London Bridge. The great society, as the rebels call themselves, pours into the city. It is a surreal invasion. They do not sack the city indiscriminately. They have a specific hit list. They target the lawyers, the scribes, the officials, the men who write the laws that bind them. They burn the Savoy Palace, the magnificent riverside home of John of Gaunt. It is filled with treasures, tapestries, silver, jewels. But the rebels have strict orders. We are zealots for truth and justice, not thieves. They take the Duke's silver vessels and throw them into the Thames. They smash his gold. They burn his furniture. One man caught trying to steal a silver goblet is reportedly thrown into the fire along with his prize. It is a terrifying, puritanical fury. The young king, Richard II, takes refuge in the Tower of London, looking out from the high stone walls as his capital burns. The sky is red with fire, and the roar of the crowd drifts up from the streets below. His advisors are paralysed with fear. They know they cannot fight this many people. The army is in France, or scattered in the north. The only weapon left is the king's own person, the mystique of the crown. So, the 14-year-old boy does the unthinkable. He agrees to meet the rebels. The first meeting at Mile End is tense but peaceful. Richard rides out, small and vulnerable against the sea of angry faces. He grants their demands. He promises to abolish serfdom, to lower land rents, to pardon the rebels. He hands out charters written on the spot. Many of the peasants, satisfied that their good king has saved them from his evil advisers, simply go home. But the hardliners, led by Wat Tyler, remain. They want more. This leads to the final cinematic showdown at Smithfield on the 15th of June. Smithfield is a marketplace, an open space usually filled with cattle and butchers. But today it is an arena. The king and his small entourage of nobles wait on one side. The rebel army, 1,000 strong, waits on the other. Wat Tyler rides out alone to meet the king. It is a moment of bizarre intimacy. Tyler treats the king not as a deity, but as an equal. He shakes the king's hand vigorously, calls him brother, and supposedly rinses his mouth with water and spits it out in front of the monarch, a shocking breach of etiquette that makes the nobles bristle. Tyler makes new, sweeping demands: the confiscation of church wealth, the end of all lordship except the king's. The tension is so thick it feels like a physical weight. Then, the snap happens. The Mayor of London, William Walworth, unable to stomach Tyler's arrogance any longer, shouts an insult. Tyler reaches for his dagger. Walworth draws his sword and strikes. Tyler falls, wounded in the neck, sliding from his horse. The rebel army, seeing their leader go down, draws their bows. "They have killed our captain," they shout. The arrows are nocked. The string is taut. A massacre of the royal party, and the death of the king is seconds away. And then Richard II performs the greatest act of his life. He is 14 years old. He does not flee. He spurs his horse forward, riding straight toward the line of archers, alone. He raises his hand and shouts, "Sirs, would you shoot your king? I am your captain. Follow me." It is a moment of supreme psychological jiu-jitsu. He pivots their loyalty from the fallen Tyler to himself. The peasants, conditioned by centuries of reverence for the anointed monarch, lower their bows. They follow him, like children following a piper, out into the open fields of Clerkenwell, away from the city. The crisis is defused by the bravery of a boy. But the aftermath is a study in betrayal. Once the rebels are dispersed and the royal forces have regrouped, the hammer falls. The charters of freedom are revoked. When a delegation of peasants later comes to the king to ask him to honour his promises, Richard's reply is cold and brutal, a line that haunts the history of class relations. "Serfs you were, and serfs you are. You shall remain in bondage, not as before, but incomparably worse. The reprisals are severe. John Ball is hanged, drawn, and quartered. The heads of the leaders are displayed on London Bridge, rotting in the sun. The peasants' revolt fails to break the system, yet it changes the atmosphere of England forever. The lords are shaken. They realise that the ground beneath their feet is not solid. Serfdom does not end by decree, but it begins to wither away quietly over the next century, as economic reality makes paid labour more efficient than forced servitude. This internal fire leaves England exhausted. The country turns inward, licking its wounds. The war with France becomes a distant concern, a bad habit that the kingdom can no longer afford. Richard II grows up to be a complex, artistic, and ultimately tyrannical king who seeks peace with France, marrying a French princess, Isabella, a child of 6, to seal a long truce. It is a pause in the bloodshed, a generational shift. The men who started the 100 Years' War are all dead. The new rulers are looking for a way out, but history is rarely a straight line. Just as England settles into a fragile peace, the chaos crosses the channel again. France is about to suffer its own internal collapse, one far more devastating than a peasant riot. The mind of the French king is fracturing, and in the cracks of his sanity, the seeds of a new invasion are being sown. We leave the sullen streets of London, where the charred ruins of the Savoy are being cleared away, and look back toward Paris, where a king is riding through a forest on a hot summer day, about to hear a voice that isn't there. We leave the sullen, fog-bound streets of London and cross the narrow sea once more, stepping into the heat of a French summer in the year 1392. The air is stifling, thick with the drone of cicadas and the dust of the road. We find ourselves in the forest of Le Mans, west of Paris, riding in a royal procession that glitters with gold and velvet, yet feels heavy with an unspoken dread. At the centre of this moving court is King Charles VI, a young man of 23. He is beloved by his people, known as Charles le Bien-Aimé, Charles the Beloved, a golden prince who seems to promise a new age of stability after the dark years of plague and war. But inside the king's mind, the weather is not sunny, it is a gathering storm. He has been acting strangely of late, murmuring to himself, looking at his uncles with sudden darting suspicion, his eyes clouded with the fatigue that sleep cannot cure. On this particular August afternoon, the heat is relentless, baking the armour of the knights until the metal burns the skin. The king is dressed in black velvet, sweating under a heavy scarlet cap, riding alone, separated slightly from his entourage. Suddenly a figure bursts from the undergrowth, a ragged man, perhaps a beggar or a hermit, wild-haired and barefoot. He grabs the bridle of the king's horse. The guards, sluggish in the heat, are too slow to stop him. The man screams a prophecy that chills the blood. "Ride no further, noble king. Turn back. You are betrayed." The guards pull the man away, but they do not arrest him. Strangely, they let him vanish back into the trees, perhaps spooked by his ghostly appearance. The king says nothing. He rides on, but the words "betrayed" are now echoing in the vaulted chambers of his mind, bouncing off the walls of his fragile sanity. A mile further down the road, the catastrophe happens. A young page, drowsy from the sun, accidentally drops his lance. It strikes a steel helmet with a loud, sharp clang. The sound acts like a key turning in a lock. Charles VI snaps. He draws his sword, his face contorting into a mask of pure terror and rage. "Forward against the traitors!" he screams. "They wish to deliver me to the enemy!" He charges, not at an English army, but at his own brother, Louis of Orléans. He strikes out wildly, killing 4 of his own knights who try to shield the Duke. The royal entourage is paralysed with horror. This is their king, God's anointed, turned into a homicidal maniac. They cannot strike him. They can only dodge and weep. Finally, the king's sword breaks, and his chamberlain tackles him from behind, wrestling him to the ground. Charles lies there, eyes wide and unseeing, murmuring about enemies in the shadows. He has fallen into a darkness from which he will never fully emerge. He is no longer Charles the Beloved. He is becoming Charles the Mad. This incident marks the beginning of a tragedy that will tear France apart from the inside out. For the next 30 years, the king drifts between periods of sanity, where he is a gentle, kind ruler who is horrified by what he has done, and periods of absence, where he does not know his own name or his wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. In his delusions, he sometimes believes he is made of glass, a condition known as the glass delusion. He refuses to let anyone touch him, terrified that he will shatter into 1,000 pieces. He inserts iron rods into his clothes to prevent himself from breaking. It is a heartbreaking image, the most powerful man in France, cowering in a corner, convinced he is as fragile as a window pane. To cheer the king, during one of his melancholy phases in 1393, the court organises a masquerade ball. It is a night intended for laughter, but it ends in fire. The king and 5 noble companions dress as wild men, wearing costumes made of linen soaked in resin and covered in frayed flax to look like hair. They enter the hall dancing, howling like beasts chained together. But the Duke of Orleans, the king's brother, enters late, drunk and carrying a torch. He leans in too close to see who is behind the masks. A spark jumps. The resin is essentially solid gasoline. In an instant, the dancers are engulfed in flames. It is the Bal des Ardents, the ball of the burning men. The king is saved only because the young Duchess of Berry, just 15 years old, has the presence of mind to throw her heavy skirt over him, smothering the fire. 4 of the other dancers burn to death in front of the horrified court. The king survives, but his mind is further shattered by the trauma. With the king mentally absent, a power vacuum opens up at the heart of the government. And in the medieval Game of Thrones, a vacuum is always filled by wolves. 2 rival factions emerge, circling the empty throne. On one side is the king's brother, Louis of Orleans, charming, arrogant, a womanizer who is rumoured, likely falsely, but the rumour sticks, to be sleeping with the queen. On the other side is the king's cousin, John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy. John is a hard, ambitious man who rules a wealthy state that stretches into Flanders. He presents himself as the champion of the people, criticising the taxes levied by the Orleans faction. The tension between these 2 men simmers for years, a cold war fought with whispers and bribes, until a dark November night in 1407. Louis of Orleans is riding through the streets of Paris after visiting the Queen. He has a small escort. As he passes the shadowy alley of the Vieille Rue du Temple, a gang of masked men rushes out. They pull the Duke from his mule and hack him to death in the muddy street. It is a brutal, professional hit. They cut off the hand that had held the reins of power and smash his skull so violently that his brains are scattered on the cobblestones. The assassins flee into the night. A few days later, John the Fearless admits to the crime, claiming it was a tyrannicide for the good of France. This murder breaks the dam. France fractures into civil war. The supporters of the murdered Duke rally around his son and his father-in-law, the Count of Armagnac, calling themselves the Armagnacs. They wear white sashes and the cross of St. George. The supporters of the Duke of Burgundy, the Burgundians, wear the St. Andrew's cross and the colour red. For the next decade, these 2 factions tear each other apart with a savagery that makes the English wars look polite. Paris becomes a slaughterhouse. The Burgundians incite the butchers and the mob to hunt down Armagnacs. The Armagnacs retake the city and execute Burgundians. They burn each other's castles and sold each other's fields. They are so busy killing each other that they forget the enemy across the water. And across the water, the English are watching. The chaos in France is like the scent of blood to a shark. In London, a new king has taken the throne. Henry IV, who usurped the crown from Richard II, spends his reign fighting his own rebellions. But his son, the young Prince Hal, soon to be Henry IV, is growing up in a school of war. He looks at the reports coming from Paris, a mad king, a divided nobility, a country in flames. He sees not a tragedy, but an opportunity. He sees a door that has been left wide open. Historians often debate the role of Queen Isabeau during this time. For centuries, she was vilified as a fat, promiscuous schemer who betrayed France, but modern scholars look at her with more sympathy. She was a foreign princess trapped in a nightmare, married to a man who often didn't recognize her or was terrified of her, trying to navigate a court filled with murderers while raising the future Charles VII. She shifted alliances between Burgundians and Armagnacs, not out of malice perhaps, but out of a desperate need to survive and protect her children. She is a woman walking on a tightrope over a pit of vipers. As we stand in the ruins of the French state, with the smoke of civil war drifting over the Seine, we can feel the ground trembling. The internal rot has prepared the way for the external blow. The Glass King sits in his palace, wrapping his arms around himself to keep from breaking, while in England, a man of iron is putting on his crown. Henry the Fife is young, pious, austere, and frighteningly focused. He does not want a raid. He does not want a treaty. He wants the whole kingdom. He believes God is on his side. And looking at the mess France has made of itself, it is hard to argue with him. The long truce is ending. The wolves of Burgundy and Armagnac have weakened the herd, and now the lion is coming to feast. The year is 1415, and the soil of northern France is turning into a quagmire under the relentless weeping of the autumn sky. We are marching with a ghost army, a column of men who look less like conquerors and more like walking corpses. This is the force of Henry V, the 28-year-old King of England, who landed in August with dreams of glory, but now finds himself fighting a war against dysentery as much as against the French. He has taken the port of Harfleur, but the siege took too long and cost him too many men, his soldiers ravaged by the bloody flux. Now, Henry is trying to dash for the safety of Calais, leading a skeleton crew of perhaps 6,000 archers and men-at-arms, tired, hungry, and sick, marching through the driving rain. But the French are not asleep this time. The factions of Armagnac and Burgundy have momentarily set aside their hatred to face the invader, gathering a massive host that shadows Henry's movements, blocking the river crossings, herding the English like sheep into a pen. On the evening of October 24th, near a tiny village called Azincourt, or Agincourt, as the English will forever mispronounce it, the trap snaps shut. The English scouts crest a ridge and see the valley before them filled with the enemy. The French army is vast, numbering perhaps 20 to 30,000, a sea of banners and campfires that stretches as far as the eye can see. The English are outnumbered at least 5 to 1. It is a moment that should inspire despair. In the French camp, the mood is confident, bordering on festive. The nobles are reportedly playing dice for the ransoms of the English lords they have not yet captured. But in the English camp, there is silence. Henry has ordered that any man who makes a noise will lose his horse or his right ear. It is a psychological masterstroke. The silence forces the men to look inward, to find their resolve in prayer and the quiet sharpening of swords. It is the silence of the grave, or perhaps the silence of the predator. The sun rises on the 25th of October, the feast of St. Crispin. The rain has stopped, but it has left a legacy. The field between the two armies is a ploughed expanse of clay that has turned into a deep, sucking mud. Henry draws up his lines. He knows he cannot attack. His only hope is to goad the French into coming to him. He places his men-at-arms in the centre and flanks them with wedges of archers, hammering sharp wooden stakes into the ground in front of them, a chevaux de frise, a primitive tank trap designed to impale charging horses. Then he does something brazen. He orders his archers to advance within range and loose a volley. The arrows arc through the sky, a stinging slap in the face of the French chivalry. The French constable, Charles d'Albret, loses patience. The order is given. The French vanguard begins to move. And here, the tragedy of Crécy repeats itself, but with a gruesome, suffocating twist. The field at Agincourt is narrow, flanked by dense woods that prevent the French from using their superior numbers to encircle the English. They are forced to funnel themselves into a tight corridor. As the heavy cavalry charges, the ground betrays them. The mud is knee-deep in places, a thick glue-like substance that robs the horses of their speed. The charge is not a thunderbolt, it is a slow-motion struggle. And then the longbows sing. The air fills with the terrifying thrum of thousands of arrows. They strike the horses, sending the beasts into a panic, throwing their riders into the muck. The first line of French knights crashes into the English stakes, and the second line crashes into the first. But the true horror of Agincourt is not the arrow storm, it is the crush. The French men-at-arms, marching on foot behind the cavalry, press forward, eager to get to grips with the English. They push into the men in front of them, who are stopped by the pile of dead horses and the English line. The pressure builds. Men are lifted off their feet by the sheer weight of the crowd behind them. Knights in full-plate armour, costing the equivalent of a modern sports car, slip in the mud and fall. Once down, they cannot get up. They are trampled by their own comrades, pressed into the liquid earth until they suffocate, drowning in mud inside their own helmets without ever receiving a scratch on their bodies. It is a catastrophe of engineering. The French have created a human dam that is collapsing under its own weight. The English archers, seeing the knights immobilized, drop their bows. They pick up mallets, axes and daggers, the tools of the camp, and run into the mud. They are light, unarmoured, agile. They swarm over the immobilized French nobles like terriers, attacking trapped bulls, stabbing through visors and armpits. It is not a battle. It is a slaughter in a slaughterhouse. Henry V fights in the centre of the line, not as a distant commander, but as a warrior king. His helmet is dented by a mace blow. His guards are killed around him. He stands his ground, a beacon in the chaos. Then a moment occurs that remains the dark stain on the golden legend of Agincourt. Toward the end of the battle, with the French dead piled man-high in wall-like heaps, a rumour sweeps the English ranks that a fresh French force is attacking the rear, raiding the baggage train. Henry, fearing that his exhausted army will be overwhelmed, if the thousands of prisoners they have captured decide to pick up weapons and fight again, gives a cold, ruthless order. Kill the prisoners. The English knights refuse. It is against the code of chivalry. And more practically, it is like burning money, for these prisoners are walking ransoms. So Henry orders a group of 200 archers, commoners who care nothing for chivalric codes, to do the dirty work. They move through the huddled groups of French captives, slitting throats and smashing skulls. It is a brutal war crime by modern standards, a desperate necessity by Henry's. When the threat to the rear turns out to be minor, the killing stops, but the field is already a graveyard of the French aristocracy. The Dukes of Alençon, Bar and Brabant are dead. The Constable of France is dead. Thousands of knights lie broken in the mud. The English casualties are miraculously light. Some sources say a few hundred, others closer to 1,000, but the disparity is staggering. As the sun sets over the carnage, Henry V summons the French herald, Mountjoy, who has watched the disaster unfold. "To whom does the victory belong?" Henry asks. "To you, sire," the herald replies, weeping. Henry names the battle after the nearby castle of Agincourt. He has achieved the impossible. He has not just won a battle, he has decapitated the French leadership in a single afternoon. The shockwave travels across Europe. The idea that God is English seems, for a moment, to be an irrefutable theological fact. Henry marches on to Calais, then to London, where he is greeted not just as a king, but as a Messiah. The choir of St. Paul's sings Te Deum, and the people line the streets, weeping with joy. But back in the silent, muddy field of Agincourt, the local peasants are left to strip the armour from the dead, burying the naked bodies in mass pits that will scar the landscape for generations. The flower of French chivalry has been cut down, not by a scythe, but by the hubris of tradition refusing to adapt to the cold reality of the arrow and the mud. The way to Paris is now open, and Henry V does not intend to stop walking until the crown of France sits upon his head. The impossible victory has made the impossible dream of a dual monarchy seem suddenly, terrifyingly real. The year is 1420, and we find ourselves in the city of Troy, a bustling textile town in the Champagne region where the air usually smells of wool and dye, but today smells of incense and high treason. 5 years have passed since the slaughter at Agincourt, years in which Henry V has methodically chewed his way through Normandy, capturing town after town with a grinding, irresistible efficiency. He is no longer just a raider, he is a landlord, securing his conquests with garrisons and English laws. But the event happening today in the Cathedral of Troy is more powerful than any siege engine. It is a wedding and a contract that will attempt to rewrite the DNA of European politics. We are witnessing the sealing of the Treaty of Troyes, a document that historians often cite as the high water mark of English ambition, the moment when the island kingdom effectively swallowed the continent. To understand how we got here, we must look at the empty chair at the negotiating table. The Dauphin Charles, the son of the mad king Charles VI, is not here. He has been exiled, branded a murderer and a bastard. The murder of John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, on that bridge in 1419 was the final nail in the coffin of French unity. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, driven by a cold fury to avenge his father, has thrown the immense weight of the Burgundian state behind Henry V. He has effectively said to the English king, "Take the crown, as long as the man who killed my father does not get it." It is a stunning reversal. The greatest peer of France has become the English king's greatest ally. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere is a strange mix of funeral solemnity and forced celebration. King Charles VI is present, but his mind is wandering in the dark forests of his delusions. He smiles vacantly, nodding at documents he cannot understand, a puppet whose strings are being pulled by the victorious Henry. Beside him stands Queen Isabeau, a woman whose reputation is about to take its final, fatal hit. To ensure the treaty holds, she declares that her son, the Dauphin, is illegitimate, the product of an affair, and therefore has no right to the throne. It is a shocking admission for a mother to make, sacrificing her child's honour to save the kingdom from further war, or perhaps simply to survive the political currents. This is a point of intense scholarly debate. Did Isabeau truly believe the Dauphin was a bastard? Or was she a pragmatic player forced into a corner, realising that only Henry V could bring order to a chaotic France? Either way, the ink dries on the parchment, and the unimaginable becomes law. Upon the death of Charles VI, Henry V of England will become the King of France. The two crowns will be united forever. To seal this monumental deal, we have a wedding. Henry V, the warrior monk, the man who lives in his armour, is marrying Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the French king. She is young, beautiful, and arguably the most eligible bachelorette in Christendom. The chroniclers tell us that Henry was supposedly smitten with her when they first met, but let us not be too romantic. In the Middle Ages, kings rarely married for love, though if they found it, it was a happy bonus. Henry is 33, a hardened veteran with a scar on his face from an arrow wound he took as a teenager. Catherine is 18, a pawn in a game of empires. Yet, as they stand at the altar, there is a glimmer of hope. Their union is meant to birth a new dynasty, a line of kings who will speak both English and French, who will rule from London and Paris, healing the rift that has bled Europe for 80 years. It is a happily ever after written by lawyers. For a brief, shimmering moment, Henry V is the master of the Western world. He rides into Paris not as a conqueror, but as the regent and heir, riding side by side with the ailing Charles VI. The crowds in Paris, starving and exhausted by the civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians, actually cheer for the English king. They shout "Noel" as he passes. They do not necessarily love the English, but they love order, and Henry V is nothing if not a creature of order. He punishes looters, stabilizes the currency, and brings a terrifyingly strict justice to a lawless city. It seems that the war is finally won. The English longbow has dictated the peace. The English king has married the French princess. The French king is his father-in-law and puppet. But while the wine flows in Paris, we must cast our gaze south, across the river Loire, to the city of Bourges. Here, the disinherited Dauphin Charles holds his court. He is a tragic figure at this stage, skinny, knock-kneed, terrified of heights and loud noises, dressed in clothes that are a bit too worn for a prince. He rules a rump state, derisively called the Kingdom of Bourges by the English. He has no money. It is said he once had to pawn his jewellery to pay for a dinner. He has been declared a bastard by his own mother and a traitor by the treaty. Yet he is still the symbol of resistance. The Armagnac faction rallies around him, not because he is inspiring, he is decidedly not, but because he is French. He is the alternative to the foreign occupation. In the south, the war continues as a series of dirty skirmishes. The Scots, England's old alliance partners, send an army to help the Dauphin, delighted for any chance to kill Englishmen on foreign soil. In 1421, at the Battle of Beaujeu, the English suffer a shock defeat. Henry's brother, the Duke of Clarence, is killed, rashly charging across a bridge without his archers, proving that arrogance runs in the family. It is a wake-up call. Henry, who had returned to England to have his queen crowned, realizes his work is not done. He sighs, puts on his armour again, and crosses the channel for what he believes will be a final campaign to crush the Dauphin. He brings Catherine with him, and she is pregnant. In December 1421, at Windsor Castle, she gives birth to a son named Henry. The news travels to the king in France, bringing joy. He has an heir. The dual monarchy has a future. The baby boy is the physical embodiment of the Treaty of Troyes, half Plantagenet, half Valois, the designated ruler of two nations. But Henry the Spiff never sees his son. He is busy besieging the town of Meaux, a stubborn fortress held by the Dauphin's men. The siege of Meaux in the winter of 1421-1422 is a grim affair. It is bitterly cold, and the English camp is struck again by dysentery, the camp fever that has killed more soldiers than French swords ever did. Henry V, the man of iron constitution, falls ill. He tries to ignore it, riding his horse until he is too weak to stay in the saddle, then being carried in a litter. He is a man who has never accepted defeat, and he refuses to accept it from a microbe. But the body of a king is just meat and bone like any other. He is taken to the Château de Vincennes, just outside Paris, the conqueror of Agincourt, the architect of the Treaty of Troyes, the man who held the world in his palm, is dying. It is a historical tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. Henry is only 35 years old. He is at the absolute zenith of his power. If he lives another 10-20 years, he likely crushes the Dauphin, unifies the kingdoms, and the history of Europe is changed forever. We might all be speaking a Franco-English pidgin today, but he fades rapidly. On his deathbed, he gives strict instructions to his brothers: maintain the alliance with Burgundy at all costs, protect the infant prince, and never release the Duke of Orléans from captivity. He dies on the 31st of August, 1422. The warrior king is gone. And then, in a twist of fate that feels scripted by a cruel dramatist, the mad King Charles VI dies just 2 months later, in October. The Treaty of Troyes kicks in. The heralds stand on the balcony in Paris and proclaim the new king, Henry VI, King of England and of France. But the king is a baby, 9 months old. He is playing with a rattle, while his uncles try to hold together an empire that stretches from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. A baby cannot lead a cavalry charge. A baby cannot negotiate with the Duke of Burgundy. The personal charisma of Henry V was the glue holding this massive, unnatural structure together. Now the glue is gone, and the structure begins to sway in the wind. In Bourges, the Dauphin Charles hears the news. He is no longer just the Dauphin. To his followers, he is Charles VII. He puts on a robe of violet, the colour of mourning for French kings, and attends a mass. He is weak, he is poor, and he is riddled with doubt. But he is alive. And in the medieval world, survival is the first qualification for kingship. The stage is set for a battle between a baby in London and a doubter in Bourges. The English seem invincible, holding Paris and the north, but the tide is subtle. It turns not with a crash, but with a whisper. And somewhere in the misty village of Domremy, on the borders of Lorraine, a young girl is beginning to hear voices in the ringing of the church bells. The miracle that the Dauphin needs is not an army, but a saint. The rational world of treaties and soldiers is about to be shattered by the irrational force of faith. The year is 1423, and the world feels like a ship that has lost its rudder in a storm. The twin giants of the age, Henry V and Charles VI, are cold in their graves, and the crowns of England and France now rest on the head of a baby who is currently teething in Windsor Castle. Henry VI is less than 2 years old, the youngest monarch to ever hold the title of King of France, a child who cannot speak, let alone command. In the absence of a king, the power falls to the uncles, and fortunately for the English, and unfortunately for the French, the man who steps into the void is arguably the most competent administrator of the 15th century, John, Duke of Bedford. He is Henry V's brother, a man who lacks the charismatic fire of the dead warrior king, but possesses a cold, terrifying efficiency. He sits in Paris, governing the occupied north with a steady hand, repairing the damage of the civil wars, minting stable coin, and ensuring that the English war machine keeps grinding forward. He is the regent of France, and he takes his duty to his infant nephew with a solemn religious seriousness. To the people of Paris, he is a stern but fair landlord. To the Dauphin in the south, he is the grim reaper in velvet robes. Down in the kingdom of Bourges, south of the river Loire, the atmosphere is heavy with the suffocating depression. The Dauphin Charles, technically Charles VII, though he has not been crowned, is a man paralyzed by doubt. He is 20 years old, physically frail, and psychologically battered. His own mother has declared him a bastard. His rival is a baby backed by the might of England and Burgundy, and his treasury is so empty that he reportedly wears sleeves that are frayed at the cuffs. The chroniclers tell us that he spends his days wandering listlessly from castle to castle, paralysed by indecision, surrounded by advisors who spend more time fighting each other than fighting the English. He is a king of shadows, ruling a court of ghosts. It is said that he questions his own bloodline in private prayers, asking God to give him a sign if he is truly the rightful heir. It is a heartbreaking image, a young man who holds the destiny of a nation in his hands, but is too afraid to close his fingers. The war, however, does not wait for him to find his confidence. In 1424, the English army, led by the Duke of Bedford, seeks to crush the last remnants of the Dauphin's military power. They meet at Verneuil in Normandy. This battle is often glossed over in popular histories, overshadowed by Agincourt, but to the people of the time it was just as terrifying. It is known as the Second Agincourt. The Dauphin has scraped together an army of French loyalists and a massive contingent of Scots, thousands of them, the Old Alliance in full force, led by the Earl of Douglas. The Scots hate the English with a passion that transcends politics, and the feeling is mutual. When the armies clash on a hot August day, there is no mercy. The English longbowmen, once again, prove to be the arbiters of death. The Scottish army is not just defeated, it is erased. The Earl of Douglas is killed, along with most of the Scottish nobility. The French army is shattered. When the news reaches Bourges, the Dauphin falls into an even deeper despair. He has no army left. The road to the south seems open. Bedford, methodical as ever, does not rush. He secures Normandy, tightens his grip, and prepares for the final strike. There is a lull of a few years, a strange quiet interlude, where the English are busy dealing with domestic squabbles back in London, where another uncle, the turbulent Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, is causing headaches, and the French are busy despairing. But by 1428, the English are ready to turn the key in the lock. The target is obvious to everyone who looks at a map. Orléans. This city is the gateway to the south. It sits on the northern bank of the Loire River, the last great natural barrier protecting the Dauphin's capital at Bourges. If Orléans falls, the English army can cross the river, sweep into the southern provinces, and the war is effectively over. Charles VII will likely flee into exile or abdicate, and the dual monarchy will become a permanent reality. The man chosen to lead this decisive campaign is Thomas Montague, the Earl of Salisbury. He is the last of the great captains from Henry V's generation, a master of siege warfare who is feared throughout France. He arrives in October 1428 with a massive train of artillery, cannons, bombards, and mortars. The age of gunpowder is slowly dawning, overlapping with the age of chivalry. These primitive cannons are stone throwers, loud and smoky, more terrifying for their noise than their accuracy, but they signal the end of the stone castle's dominance. Salisbury encircles the city, capturing the bridgehead and the surrounding forts, the Tourelles. The citizens of Orléans, led by the brave but illegitimate bastard of Orléans, Jean de Dunois, prepare for a siege of starvation. They destroy the suburbs to deny cover to the English, retreating behind their high walls to watch the English campfires multiply in the darkness. But then, fate intervenes with a moment of bizarre, almost darkly comic contingency. On a Sunday in late October, the Earl of Salisbury climbs one of the captured towers to survey the city. He is looking through a window, discussing tactics. Inside the city, a young page boy is playing around with a cannon. Some sources say he was trying to look busy, others that he was just a bored child. He accidentally fires it. The ball flies across the river, smashes into the window frame where Salisbury is standing, and a splinter of stone shears off half of the Earl's face. He does not die immediately. He lingers for a week in agony before succumbing. It is a shock to the English command. They have lost their best general to a lucky shot by a child. The command falls to the Earl of Suffolk and Lord Talbot, men of courage, but perhaps less strategic genius than Salisbury or Bedford. They lack the men to fully encircle the city, so they build a series of forts around it, trying to starve it out. But the gaps between the forts are wide enough for supplies to occasionally slip through. The siege drags on through the winter of 1428-1429. It becomes the cynosure of all Europe. Everyone knows that the fate of France is being decided at the walls of Orléans. Inside the city, the mood oscillates between defiance and doom. They eat horses, then cats, then rats. They mock the English from the walls, playing music and shouting insults, but their stomachs are empty. They send desperate messages to the Dauphin. Send help, or we die. But at the court in Chinon, the Dauphin is paralysed. He has no money to raise a relief army. His generals tell him it is hopeless, that facing the English in open battle is suicide. He is reportedly preparing to flee to Scotland or Spain, to abandon France entirely. The kingdom is hanging by a thread, a single fraying rope, holding up the weight of 1,000 years of history. The prophecy of the maid begins to circulate in the whispers of the peasantry, an old prediction attributed to Merlin, or perhaps Marie d'Avignon, stating that France would be lost by a woman and saved by a virgin. The people look at Queen Isabeau, who lost France with the Treaty of Troyes, and they wonder, where is the virgin? The despair is absolute. The logic of the world says that France is finished. The English are disciplined, wealthy, and victorious. The French are divided, broke, and defeated. There is no rational reason to believe the outcome will change. But history is not always rational. Sometimes it bends to forces that cannot be measured in numbers of arches or weight of gold. As the snow melts in early 1429, and the first green shoots of spring appear in the muddy fields of Lorraine, a teenage girl with no military training, no education, and no shoes is leaving her village. She tells her uncle that she needs a horse and an escort because the King of Heaven has told her to go to Orléans. It sounds like madness. It sounds like the delusion of a peasant girl who has watched too many religious plays. But she walks with a certainty that unnerves the men she meets. She is walking toward the Dauphin, carrying a spark that will ignite the damp, rotten wood of the French spirit. The year of deaths and despair is ending. The year of miracles is about to begin. The infant king in London sleeps soundly, unaware that his crown is about to be challenged not by a great lord, but by a voice in the wind. We stand now in the muddy garden of a small house in Domremy, a village on the very edge of the French kingdom, where the air smells of wet earth and wood smoke. It is a place so insignificant that it barely appears on the maps of the time. Yet it is here, amidst the scratching of chickens and the rustle of apple trees, that the history of Europe pivots. A peasant girl of 16, illiterate and unworldly, stands frozen, her eyes wide, staring at a light that no one else can see. Her name is Johanna, though the world will know her as Joan. She claims that for years, voices have been speaking to her, the voices of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, telling her that she, a simple shepherdess who has never held a sword, must drive the English out of France and crown the Dauphin at Rheims. To the modern mind, this sounds like schizophrenia or a hallucination born of trauma. To the medieval mind, it is a terrifying binary. She is either a witch sent by the devil or a prophet sent by God. There is no middle ground. Driven by a compulsion she cannot resist, Joan leaves her home in early 1429. She bullies the local garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, into giving her an escort, reportedly telling him, "I must be at the king's side. There is no one in the world, neither king, nor duke, nor daughter of the King of Scotland, who can recover the kingdom of France." Her conviction is so absolute, so physically palpable, that it breaks down the cynicism of the hardened soldiers. They give her a horse and men's clothing, a practical necessity for a girl travelling through war zones, but a choice that will later be used to condemn her. She cuts her hair short, puts on a tunic, and rides nearly 300 miles through enemy territory to the castle of Chinon, where the Dauphin Charles is hiding from his own destiny. The meeting at Chinon is the stuff of legend. Charles VII, hearing that a maid has arrived promising miracles, decides to test her. He hides himself in the crowd of courtiers dressed in plain clothes, while placing a nobleman on the throne to act as a decoy. The doors open and Joan enters. She has never seen the king, never seen a court, yet she ignores the decoy entirely. She walks straight to the trembling young man in the drab tunic hiding in the back, kneels before him and says, "God give you life, gentle king." When Charles denies his identity, she insists, "In the name of God, it is you and no other." She then whisks him aside for a private conversation. No one knows what was said, but the effect is instantaneous. Charles, who had been crushed by doubt about his legitimacy, emerges from the room with a lighted face, looking, for the first time, like a king. Historians speculate that she told him something only God could know, perhaps confirming the secret prayer he had made, asking about his true parentage. But a parlour trick is not enough to give a teenage girl command of an army. Charles sends her to Poitiers to be examined by theologians. They probe her for weeks, looking for signs of heresy or madness. They find only humility, virginity, devotion, and honesty. They advise the king to use her. To doubt or abandon her, they say, would be to reject the Holy Spirit. So Charles gives her a suit of white armour, a banner embroidered with the fleur-de-lis, and sends her to Orléans. The transformation of the army is immediate and bizarre. Joan banishes the camp followers, prostitutes, forbids looting, and orders the rough mercenaries to stop swearing and go to confession. These men, who would slit a throat for a coin, surprisingly obey her. They are terrified of her, or perhaps they are just desperate enough to believe that she is their lucky charm. Joan arrives at Orléans on the 29th of April. The city is starving. The people are losing hope. She enters not stealthily, but openly, riding a white horse, her banner snapping in the wind. The crowd goes wild. They try to touch her boots, her horse, her stirrups. She is the maid, the pucelle, the promised saviour. Her arrival coincides with a shift in the wind that allows supply boats to slip past the English blockade, a meteorological fluke that the citizens immediately brand a miracle. She meets the military commander of the city, Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans. He is a pragmatic, battle-hardened soldier who initially plans to use her as a mascot, a cheerleader to boost morale while the men do the fighting. He tells her to rest. Joan tells him to wake up. She demands to attack immediately. On the 4th of May, while Dunois is sleeping, Joan wakes up suddenly, shouting that her voices are telling her French blood is being spilled. She rushes out, grabs her banner, and rides to the eastern gate. A skirmish is indeed happening at the English fort of Saint-Lô. Joan charges into the fray. The sight of her, a girl in white armour in the thick of the killing, electrifies the French soldiers. They surge forward with a ferocity the English have never seen. The fort falls. It is the first French victory in months. But the real test is the main English stronghold, the fortress of Les Tourelles, guarding the bridge. The French captains argue it is too strong to take. They want to wait for reinforcements. Joan calls them cowards. "You have been to your council," she tells them, "and I have been to mine." She rallies the common soldiers and the town militia, bypassing the nobles. On the 7th of May, the assault begins. It is a brutal, grinding climb, up ladders, under a hail of arrows and gunfire. In the heat of the battle, Joan is struck. An arrow pierces her armour, plunging deep into her shoulder and neck area. She falls into the ditch. The English cheer. The witch is dead. The French waver. But Joan is not dead. She is carried to safety, where she weeps with pain, a reminder that she is just a scared teenager after all. But then she does the unthinkable. She pulls the arrow out, or has it pulled, has the wound dressed with olive oil and lard, and then she goes back. When her banner appears again on the ramparts, the English are paralysed with superstitious terror. They believe she is immortal, a demon that cannot be killed. The French, seeing their saint return from the dead, roar with a frenzy that overwhelms the defences. They swarm the walls. The English commander, Glasdale, who had shouted insults at Joan earlier, calling her a whore, falls from the burning bridge into the river and drowns in his heavy armour. Joan, watching him fall, reportedly weeps for his soul. The next morning, the 8th of May, the English army, led by Talbot, marches out of their remaining forts and forms a battle line. They are inviting a fight. Joan rides out, but she forbids the French to attack. "It is Sunday," she says. "Let them go." And in a scene of surreal stillness, the English army stands for an hour, stares at the French, and then turns around and marches away. The siege of Orléans is over. The bells of the city ring out, a cacophony of joy that can be heard for miles. The girl from Dom Rémy has done in 4 days what the generals could not do in 6 months. She has broken the deadlock. The impact of Orléans cannot be overstated. It is the psychological turning point of the 100 Years' War. The myth of English invincibility is shattered. The French realise that God might not be English after all, but Joan is not finished. She goes to the king and tells him, "We must go to Reims." It is a march deep into enemy territory, a path blocked by English garrisons. The generals say it is impossible. Joan says, "I have only a year and a little longer. We must work." She senses her own clock ticking. She pushes the army north into the campaign of the Loire. The English retreat, but they are caught at Patay on the 18th of June. This time, the French cavalry, emboldened by Joan, charges before the English archers can plant their stakes. It is a massacre, a reverse Agincourt. The English longbowmen are cut down. The legendary Talbot is captured. The road to Rheims lies open. The towns along the way, which had sworn loyalty to the English, open their gates to the Maid without a fight. Troyes, Chalons, Rheims, they all capitulate, swept up in the momentum of the miracle. On the 17th of July, 1429, the Dauphin Charles enters the great cathedral. The holy oil, the Saint-Ampoule, is brought forth. Joan stands beside him near the altar, holding her banner. As the crown is placed on his head and the chants of Viva Rex in Etemum echo off the stone vaults, Charles VII becomes the true King of France. The bastard of Bourges is gone. The anointed one has risen. Joan weeps openly. Her mission, the impossible task given to her by the voices in the garden, is complete. She turns to the king and asks to go home, to her mother and her sheep. But politics is a machine that eats miracles. The king will not let her go. She is too valuable, too powerful a symbol. And so, the girl who saved France is forced to stay on the path of war, a path that leads away from the light of Rome and into the shadows of betrayal. The candles of the coronation flicker and fade, and we can sense the darkness gathering around the maid, a darkness that smells of burning wood and cold judicial ink. The holy oil has dried on the forehead of the king, and the echoes of the Te Deum have faded into the rafters of Rheims Cathedral, leaving behind a silence that feels less like peace and more like hesitation. We find ourselves in the autumn of 1429, where the golden light of the coronation is slowly being replaced by the grey fog of political reality. Joan of Arc has given Charles VII his crown, but she cannot give him a personality transplant. He remains a cautious, cerebral man who prefers ink to blood. And while Joan is urging him to march on Paris, to strike while the iron is white hot, Charles is listening to his advisers, who whisper that diplomacy is safer. They negotiate truces with the Duke of Burgundy, pauses that Joan calls treachery. She is a creature of absolutes living in a world of compromise. The court begins to view her not as a saviour, but as a liability, a loose cannon who doesn't understand that the war is now a chess match, not a crusade. The tension comes to a head in September, outside the walls of Paris. Joan leads an assault on the capital, standing on the edge of the moat, calling for the city to surrender. But the king is miles away, delaying the reinforcements. A crossbow bolt pierces Joan's thigh. She lies in the mud until nightfall, urging her men forward, but the attack is called off. It is her first major failure. The king orders a retreat, disbanding the army of the coronation. Joan, in a gesture of heartbreak, hangs her suit of white armour in the Basilica of Saint-Denis as an offering, a silent admission that her season of invincibility has passed. The winter is cold and bitter. Joan is kept at court like a gilded pet, paraded in silk dresses she hates, longing for the weight of mail and the smell of a horse. But by the spring of 1430 she can take it no longer. Without the king's permission, she rides out with a small band of volunteers to defend the town of Compiègne, which is under siege by the Burgundians. On the 23rd of May, she leads a sortie outside the walls. It is a skirmish like 100 others, but fate is waiting in the long grass. The Burgundians counterattack. Joan's men retreat toward the drawbridge. Joan stays behind to cover them, fighting with the fury of a cornered lioness. But the governor of the town, in a moment of panic, or perhaps calculated betrayal, orders the bridge raised while Joan is still outside. She is pulled from her horse by an archer. There is no bolt of lightning, no angel with a flaming sword. She is just a girl in the dirt, surrounded by men who cannot believe their luck. The maid is captured. Here begins the tragedy that stains the reign of Charles VII forever. Joan is a prisoner of the Burgundians, technically an ally of the English, but she is for sale. The price is set at 10,000 livres tournois, a king's ransom. Charles VII, the man who owes his crown, his kingdom, and his very identity to this girl, does absolutely nothing. He does not offer a ransom, he does not threaten retaliation, he does not even write a letter. He washes his hands of her, fearful that associating with a witch might taint his new legitimacy. It is a silence so loud it screams. The English, however, are eager to pay. They buy her, not to keep her, but to kill her. They need to prove that she is a heretic, for if she is a heretic, then Charles VII's coronation was the work of the devil, and his kingship is invalid. It is not a trial for justice, it is a trial for propaganda. Joan is taken to the city of Rouen in Normandy, the headquarters of the English occupation. She is locked in a tower, chained to a block of wood, guarded by 5 rough English soldiers who mock her day and night. The trial begins in February 1431. It is a spectacle of intimidation. Presiding over it is Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a French cleric loyal to the English cause, a man with a sharp legal mind and a heart of flint. He assembles a tribunal of dozens of theologians and lawyers. Against them stands one illiterate 19-year-old girl. They question her for hours, jumping from topic to topic, trying to trap her into blasphemy. But here, under the crushing weight of the Church's authority, Joan shines with a brilliance that historians still marvel at. When asked the trap question, "Do you know yourself to be in God's grace?" a question with no right answer, for to say yes is heresy, claiming certainty of salvation, and to say no is an admission of guilt, she replies, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." The tribunal is stunned. The transcripts of the trial, which still exist, reveal a mind of startling clarity. She navigates the theological minefield with a peasant's common sense and a saint's composure. They ask about her men's clothing, which they claim is an abomination. She replies simply that it is a practical necessity for living among soldiers and protecting her virtue in prison. They ask about her voices. She refuses to betray them. Frustrated by her resilience, Cauchon changes tactics. He wears her down. She falls sick, likely from food poisoning, but they nurse her back to health so they can execute her properly. They threaten her with the rack, taking her to the torture chamber, but she looks at the instruments and says, "If you tear my limbs apart, I will tell you nothing else." Finally, on the 24th of May, they take her to a cemetery, show her the stake, and terrify her into signing a document of abjuration, recanting her visions. In a moment of human weakness, terrified of the fire, she signs, or marks a cross. She is sentenced to life imprisonment. She puts on a dress. But the English are furious. They want her dead. A few days later, the trap is sprung. Joan is found in her cell, wearing men's clothes again. She claims her guards forced her, or that they stole her dress, leaving her no choice. But legally, this makes her a relapsed heretic. The sentence is automatic: death by fire. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan is led to the old market square in Rouen. She's dressed in a long chemise soaked in sulphur to make it burn faster. A tall plaster hat is placed on her head, reading "Heretic, Relapsed, Apostate, Idolater." The crowd is massive. English soldiers, French citizens, weeping monks. She is tied to a stake that has been built unusually high, so the executioner cannot reach her to strangle her, a small mercy usually granted to victims to spare them the agony of the flames. She asks for a cross. An English soldier, moved by pity, ties 2 sticks together and hands them to her. She kisses it and puts it in her bosom. Then a processional cross is brought from a nearby church and held up before her eyes, so she can see it through the smoke. The fire is lit as the flames climb the wood, crackling and roaring. The crowd falls silent. There is no screaming of curses, no begging for life. Joan cries out the name Jesus repeatedly. Her last word, heard clearly over the roar of the fire, is simply "Jesus." Then her head slumps forward. She is gone. The English order the fire raked back to expose her charred body, proving to the crowd that she is truly dead and not a spirit who has flown away. They then burn the remains twice more until only ash is left, which is thrown into the Seine River so no relics can be kept. But as the smoke clears, a strange unease settles over the square. The executioner arrives at the local tavern later that night, shaking, telling anyone who will listen that he has burned a saint and that his soul is damned. The English secretary, John Tressart, returns to his office weeping, saying, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." They thought that by destroying her body, they would destroy her power. They were wrong. The fire at Rouen does not consume Joan's legend. It hardens it like clay in a kiln. She becomes a martyr, a symbol far more dangerous in death than she was in life. Charles VII, safe in his castle, has his crown, but he has lost his honour. And the English, staring at the empty spot where the stake stood, are beginning to realise that the wind has changed. The witch is dead, but the fire she lit in the hearts of the French people is burning out of control. The long, slow sunset of the English Empire in France has begun. The ashes of the Maid have washed out to sea, carried by the currents of the Seine to the English Channel, but the fire she lit refuses to go out. We find ourselves in December of 1431, just months after the flames of Rouen consumed Joanne, standing in the nave of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The English have decided that they need to answer the coronation of Charles VII with a spectacle of their own, a piece of political theatre designed to remind the French who is really in charge. They bring the young King Henry VI, now 10 years old, to be crowned King of France. But from the moment the boy king arrives, the event feels wrong. It lacks the mystical aura of Reims. The ceremony is rushed, performed by an English cardinal instead of a French bishop, a breach of protocol that offends the local clergy. The food at the banquet is reportedly cold and stale, a culinary sin that the Parisians, who take their dining seriously even in wartime, find unforgivable. The young king, pale and quiet, looks less like a ruler of 2 nations and more like a frightened child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. The people of Paris watch in sullen silence. They have seen the miracle of Joan, and this hollow pageantry feels like a cheap imitation. The English are trying to project power, but they are only projecting anxiety. As the 1430s drag on, the ground beneath the English occupation begins to turn into quicksand. The man holding it altogether, the Duke of Bedford, is exhausted. He has spent a decade playing whack-a-mole with French resistance, but his treasury is empty, and his greatest ally, the Duke of Burgundy, is getting restless. Philip the Good is a man of business as much as a prince of blood. He looks at his ledgers and sees that the war is bad for trade. The Flemish wool merchants, the backbone of his economy, are tired of English pirates and closed markets. Furthermore, the emotional wound that drove him into the English alliance, the murder of his father, has scabbed over with the passage of 15 years. Revenge is a dish best served cold, but after a decade and a half, it just tastes stale. Philip begins to wonder if he is backing the wrong horse. The turning point arrives in the summer of 1435 in the city of Arras. It is here that we witness the diplomatic World Cup of the Middle Ages. A massive peace conference is convened, attended by cardinals, dukes and envoys from every corner of Europe. The English delegation arrives expecting to negotiate a truce, but they find themselves walking into a trap. The French and Burgundians have already been talking in secret. The atmosphere is tense, thick with the scent of beeswax and betrayal. The Pope's envoys urge the English to give up the claim to the French throne in exchange for keeping Normandy and Aquitaine. It is a sensible offer, a way to keep a massive empire without endless war. But the English, trapped by the ghost of Henry V and the pride of their warrior aristocracy, refuse. They storm out of the conference in a huff, led by Cardinal Beaufort, believing that God is still English. It is a fatal miscalculation. The moment the English leave, the real business begins. On September 21st, 1435, the Treaty of Arras is signed. It is a diplomatic earthquake. Philip the Good formally switches sides, abandoning the English alliance to rejoin the French fold. But the reconciliation comes with a heavy price for Charles VII. He has to perform a public act of contrition for the murder of John the Fearless. He states that the killing was wicked and done without his knowledge, a convenient lie that everyone accepts, and he pays Philip a massive fortune in gold and land. It is a humiliation for the king, but Charles VII, the well-served, listens to his pragmatic advisers. He knows that honour does not win wars, alliances do. He swallows his pride to swallow his kingdom. While the ink is drying at Arras, a tragedy strikes the English cause that is perhaps more devastating than any lost battle. In Rouen, the Duke of Bedford dies. He was 46 years old, worn out by the crushing weight of ruling a hostile country. He was the anchor, the adult in the room, the only man with the administrative genius to keep the dual monarchy functioning. With him gone, the English administration in France loses its brain. The leadership fractures into bickering factions, the Hawks led by the Duke of Gloucester and the Doves led by Cardinal Beaufort. The baby king in London, now a teenager, is showing signs that he has inherited his French grandfather's madness rather than his English father's steel. He is pious, gentle, and utterly unsuited for the wolf pit of medieval politics. The ship is listing, the captain is dead, and the crew is fighting over the wheel. The consequences of Arras are immediate. The English are now isolated, an island nation trying to hold down a continental giant that has just remembered its own strength. The Burgundian buffer zone vanishes. In the spring of 1436, the French army, led by the Constable Arthur de Richemont, a grim, hard-bitten soldier who hates the English with a passion, marches on Paris. But there is no great siege. There is no starving out the population. The Parisians, who had cheered Henry V 15 years earlier, now open the gates themselves. They rise up, barricading the streets with chains, throwing furniture from windows onto the English patrols. The English garrison, commanded by Lord Willoughby, is forced to retreat into the Bastille. They are trapped, surrounded not by an army, but by a city that has decided it is French again. A few days later, the English are allowed to leave. It is a scene of profound melancholy. The English soldiers march out of the Saint-Denis gate, jeered by the crowds, pelted with mud and rotten vegetables. They are not leaving as conquerors. They are being evicted like bad tenants. Charles VII does not enter the city immediately. He is still cautious, still Charles. But the symbol is powerful. Paris, the heart of the kingdom, is beating again. The English are pushed back to Normandy and the coast. The dream of the dual monarchy, The vision of Henry V effectively dies in the spring of 1436, though the ghost will rattle its chains for another 17 years. However, the war does not end. It changes character. It becomes a slow, grinding war of attrition, a vegetable war of raids and counter-raids that ruins the countryside without changing the map. A new horror emerges in the vacuum: the accoucheurs, or flayers. These are bands of unemployed mercenaries who strip the peasants of everything: their clothes, their food, their dignity, leaving them flayed like animals. France is winning, but France is bleeding. Charles VII, now growing into his role as the victorious, realizes that to finish the job, he needs more than just alliances. He needs to fix the very machine of war. He looks at his undisciplined knights, his roaming bands of flayers, and he decides to do something that no king has done since the Roman Empire. He decides to build a professional standing army. In the quiet chateaux of the Loire, the king issues the ordonnance of 1439 and 1445. He creates the compagnies d'ordonnance, units of heavy cavalry that are paid, fed, and disciplined by the state, not by local lords. He creates the Franc archers, a militia of commoners trained to use the bow, and most importantly, he invests in a new, terrifying technology that has been maturing in the background of the war: artillery. He hires two brothers, Jean and Gaspard Bureau, men of low birth but high genius, to reorganize the French artillery train. They create cannons that are not just noisy pots, but standardized mobile weapons on wheeled carriages that can be moved quickly and fired accurately. The age of the castle is ending. The age of the cannon is beginning. The English, meanwhile, are distracted. The boy king Henry VI marries a French princess, Margaret of Anjou, in 1445, hoping for peace. But Margaret is a strong-willed, fierce woman in a court of weak men, and her presence polarizes the English nobility. The War of the Roses is brewing in the misty hills of England, drawing energy and attention away from France. The English garrisons in Normandy sit and wait, unpaid and unsupported, watching the French borders bristle with new spears and new guns. The truce holds, for a few years, the Truce of Tours, but it is the silence of a predator crouching before the leap. The final act is approaching, and it will not be fought with chivalry, but with gunpowder. The sun is setting on the Middle Ages, and the sky is turning the colour of sulphur. The year is 1449, and the air of northern France no longer smells of wood smoke and damp wool. It smells of sulphur, charcoal, and saltpetre, the devil's perfume. The Truce of Tours, which had hung like a thin, fraying cobweb over the conflict for 5 years, snaps in late March. The trigger is a clumsy English raid on the town of Fougères, a breach of the peace that gives Charles VII exactly the excuse he has been waiting for. But the war that resumes is not the war of his ancestors. The French king does not summon a feudal levy of unruly dukes who argue over who gets to ride in the front. He summons the Bureau brothers. Jean and Gaspard Bureau are not knights, they are bureaucrats, technicians, men of the middle class who look at a castle wall not as a monument to chivalry, but as a math problem to be solved with ballistics. They have spent the truce building the first modern artillery train in European history. Their cannons are not the erratic pot-bellied bombards of the past that were just as likely to blow up the gunner as the target. They are sleek, bronze-cast culverins mounted on wheeled carriages, capable of moving at the speed of a marching army and firing iron balls with terrifying frequency. The English garrisons in Normandy, sitting comfortably behind their high stone walls, believing that sieges are polite affairs that last for months, are about to wake up to a nightmare of efficiency. The campaign to retake Normandy is a medieval blitzkrieg. It is shocking in its speed. In the past, a city like Rouen or Harfleur would hold out for half a year, starving the besiegers into submission. Now, the Bureau brothers roll their guns up to the walls, dig in, and simply batter the stone into gravel. Walls that had stood for centuries crumble in days. The psychological impact is devastating. The English commanders look at the crumbling masonry and realise that the rules of geometry have changed. Height and thickness no longer guarantee safety. Town after town throws open its gates, terrified not of the French soldiers, but of the thunder that brings down their homes. Charles VII, the victorious, rides through Normandy, not as a warrior, but as a CEO, inspecting a successful merger. He takes Rouen in October 1449. The English Duke of Somerset, utterly outmatched, surrenders the capital of Normandy and marches his humiliated garrison out in the rain. But the English, stubborn as ever, make one last attempt to turn the tide. In the spring of 1450, a relief army lands at Cherbourg under the command of Sir Thomas Kyriel. He is a veteran of the old school, a man who remembers the glory days of Agincourt. He marches inland with about 4,000 men, looking to link up with the remaining garrisons. On the 15th of April, near the village of Formigny, he encounters a small French force. Kyriel does exactly what English commanders have done for 100 years. He finds a good defensive position near a stream, orders his men to dismount, and has his archers plant their sharp wooden stakes in the ground. He creates a porcupine of yew and steel, daring the French to charge. It is the classic recipe for victory. It worked at Crécy, it worked at Poitiers, it worked at Agincourt. He waits for the French chivalry to impale themselves on his defences. But the French do not charge. The Count of Clermont, commanding the French vanguard, looks at the English position and realises he doesn't have to play their game. He signals to the rear. 2 small culverins are wheeled forward. They are set up just out of bowshot. The gunners light the fuses. Boom. An iron ball tears through the English lines. Then another, and another. The English archers, the masters of the battlefield for a century, stand helpless. They cannot shoot back. The guns are too far away. They are being picked off like ducks in a gallery. It is a moment of profound historical irony. The weapon that ended the dominance of the mounted knight is now being rendered obsolete by the weapon that will end the dominance of the archer. The English discipline, usually ironclad, begins to crack. They cannot just stand there and die. Goaded into action, a group of English archers breaks ranks and charges the guns, capturing them in a brief, desperate scuffle. But the formation is broken. The porcupine has lost its quills. At that precise moment, a second French army, led by the Constable Arthur de Richemont, arrives on the English flank. It is the hammer falling on the anvil. The French heavy cavalry charges, sweeping over the disorganized English infantry. There is no miracle this time. The English army is annihilated. Nearly 4,000 men are killed or captured. Kyriel is taken prisoner. Formigny is not just a defeat. It is an obituary for the tactic that built the English Empire. The longbow has met its match in the cannon. By August 1450, the last English soldier leaves Normandy, the duchy that was the ancestral home of William the Conqueror. The land that Henry V had fought so hard to secure is French once more. The loss sends shockwaves through England. The populace, furious and frightened, looks for scapegoats. The Duke of Suffolk, the King's chief minister, is blamed for the disaster. He is banished, but as he sails into exile, his ship is intercepted by disgruntled sailors. They drag him onto a small boat, subject him to a mock trial, and behead him with a rusty sword on the gunwale. It is a gruesome sign of the chaos devouring England. Shortly after, the commoners of Kent rise up in Jack Cade's rebellion. marching on London, burning records and killing officials. England is eating itself. The War of the Roses is no longer a distant threat. It is knocking on the door. Meanwhile, Charles VII turns his gaze south. Normandy is secured. Now only one prize remains: Gascony. This vast region in the southwest, centred on Bordeaux, is a different beast entirely. It has been English for 300 years. Longer than some parts of England have been English. The people there speak a dialect of Occitan. They drink claret wine, which they sell to London, and they regard the French kings in Paris as foreign meddlers. They are not occupied by the English, they are the English subjects of the south. When the French armies march into Gascony in 1451, taking Bordeaux, the locals are sullen. They do not cheer. They resent the new French taxes and the arrogant northern governors. They start sending secret letters to London, whispering, "If you come back, we will open the gates." It is a siren song that the beleaguered English government cannot resist. They need a victory to distract from the chaos at home. They need a hero. And they have one left, John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury. He is over 60 years old, ancient for a medieval warrior, but he is a living legend, known as the English Achilles. He was the man captured at Patay, the man who terrified the French for decades. He is released from captivity and given command of a final expedition. In October 1452, Talbot lands near Bordeaux. The citizens, true to their word, open the gates and kick out the French garrison. Talbot marches in to a hero's welcome. For a brief, shining moment, it seems like the good old days are back. The English lion roars one last time in the south, but Charles VII is not the panicked Dauphin of his youth. He does not rush. He waits through the winter, gathering his strength, assembling the largest artillery train Europe has ever seen. He sends the Bureau brothers south. In the summer of 1453, 3 French armies move into Gascony like the claws of a trap. They do not seek a battle. They seek to strangle the English hold. They lay siege to the town of Castillon on the river Dordogne. But this is not a normal siege. Jean Bureau builds a fortified camp outside the town, a massive earthwork enclosure equipped with over 300 cannons. He is not trying to keep the English out. He is inviting them in. He is setting a trap, baiting the English Achilles to come and die. Talbot, sitting in Bordeaux, hears that the French are at Castillon. He is told, falsely, that the French are retreating, that they are fleeing in panic. His pride and the pleas of the Gascon townsfolk goad him into action. He rides out with a small force, outpacing his infantry and artillery, determined to catch the fleeing French. He arrives at Castillon on the morning of July 17th, 1453. He sees a cloud of dust and thinks the French are running. He orders an immediate attack. He does not wait for his archers to form up. He does not scout the enemy position. He charges straight at the earthworks of Jean Bureau. We pause here, on the edge of the final field. The sun is high and hot, baking the vineyards of the Dordogne. The old general, Talbot, is riding a white cob, wearing a surcoat of purple velvet, his white hair flowing in the wind. He is the embodiment of the medieval age, brave, impulsive, aristocratic, believing that courage alone can conquer the world. Facing him, behind a wall of dirt and timber, is a line of cold black iron muzzles, manned by mathematicians holding linstocks. The distance between them is only a few hundred yards, but in reality it is the distance between 2 eras of human history. The charge begins. The hooves thunder on the dry earth. The English shout, "Talbot, St. George," and then the order is given. In the French camp, the linstocks touch the powder. The world turns white. The roar that tears across the field of Castillon on that July morning in 1453 is not just the sound of gunpowder. It is the sound of a door slamming shut on the Middle Ages. The French artillery, hidden behind the earthworks, unleashes a storm of iron and lead that shreds the air and the bodies of the charging English knights. It is a massacre of industrial proportions. John Talbot, the old lion, the man who believed that sheer will could bend reality, finds himself riding into a hurricane. His horse is struck by a cannonball, crumbling beneath him, pinning the English Achilles to the dry, dusty earth. In the chaotic swirl of smoke, there is no chivalrous pause, no noble exchanging of names. A French archer, seeing the fallen general, steps forward with a battle axe and delivers the final blow. Talbot is dead. With him dies the spirit of the English occupation. The rest of the English force, demoralised and outgunned, is swept away by the counter-attack of the Breton cavalry. They are pushed into the river Dordogne, where the water turns red, carrying the bodies of the last invaders down toward the sea. The survivors flee back to Bordeaux, but the city knows the game is up. There is no relief coming from London. There is no new Henry V to save them. Jean Bureau rolls his terrible guns up to the gates of Bordeaux, and the citizens, pragmatic to the end, send out envoys. On October 19th, 1453, the French army marches into the city. The English banners are lowered, folded and packed away. The ships in the harbour hoist their sails, heavy with refugees, and turn their prows north toward the grey waters of the Channel, leaving behind the vineyards and the sun that they had claimed for 3 centuries. They leave only Calais, a tiny, stubborn foothold that will remain English for another century, a lonely sentinel looking out over a lost empire. But the war, the great sprawling, multi-generational tragedy that consumed 5 generations of kings, is finally, irrevocably over. There is no grand treaty signed in 1453, no summit of emperors to declare the peace. The war simply stops because England can no longer fight it. The island kingdom is exhausted, bankrupt, and sliding into the madness of its own civil war. The Wars of the Roses, where the veterans of France will use the savage skills they learned at Agincourt and Verneuil to kill each other in the muddy fields of Yorkshire. But for France, the silence that falls over the land is profound. The wolves slowly retreat into the deep forests. The villages, burned and rebuilt a dozen times, begin to grow old again. The free companies are hunted down or absorbed into the king's new army. Charles VII, the king who began his reign as a terrified teenager hiding in the south, ends it as the absolute monarch of a unified, powerful nation. He has forged France in the fire of adversity. The war has created a national identity. Before 1337, a man might have called himself a Norman, a Gascon, or a Breton. Now, having bled together against the goddams, as Joan of Arc called the English, they are beginning to call themselves French. The monarchy is stronger than ever, armed with tax-collecting powers and a standing army that answers only to the crown. The feudal age, where a duke could challenge a king, is dying along with the stone castles that can no longer withstand the new artillery. As we look back over the 116 years of conflict, the scale of the suffering is almost impossible to grasp. It was a war of contradictions, of chivalric beauty and grotesque cruelty, of religious faith and cynical betrayal, of black death and golden victories. It gave us the legends of the Black Prince and the Maid of Orleans, figures who shine so brightly they almost seem like myths, yet they were flesh and blood, people who felt the cold rain and the fear of death just as we do. It changed the way wars are fought, moving from the individual heroism of the mounted knight to the collective discipline of the archer and the mathematical destruction of the gunner. It elevated the infantryman, the commoner, to the arbiter of battle. It severed the political umbilical cord that had connected England and France since the Norman conquest, forcing each nation to find its own separate destiny. England turned to the sea. beginning the maritime journey that would eventually build a global empire. France turned to the land, becoming the great centralised power of the continent. But history is not just about maps and kings, it is about the quiet resilience of the human spirit. Think of the peasant in 1453 ploughing a field near Patay. He turns up a rusted arrowhead, a relic of a battle his grandfather fought. He looks at it for a moment, wiping the dirt away with his thumb, and then tosses it into the hedge. He has wheat to sow. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of violet and rose, the same sky that looked down on the slaughter of Crécy, the miracle of Orléans, and the tragedy of Rouen. The land remembers, but it also forgives. The grass grows over the mass graves. The ivy climbs the ruined towers. The voices of the dead, the shout of the captain, the prayer of the priest, the cry of the wounded, fade into the wind, becoming part of the rustling leaves. The 100 Years' War becomes a story, a song, a bedtime history whispered in the dark, a reminder that even the longest night eventually gives way to the dawn. The conflict that seemed like it would last forever has ended, proving that all things, no matter how terrible or how glorious, must eventually pass into the quiet dignity of the past, and now the journey is complete. The armies have marched away, the banners have faded, and the history books are closed. It is time to let the weight of the centuries slide from your shoulders. Imagine the landscape of France as it settles into a deep, centuries-long slumber. The fires are extinguished. The stone walls of the castles are cool to the touch, bathed in the silver light of a full moon that hangs motionless in a star-dusted sky. The only sound is the gentle rhythmic breathing of the world, the wind moving softly through the leaves of the ancient oaks, the water of the Loire lapping against the banks, the hoot of a distant owl watching over the ruins. You are safe here, floating above the timeline, far removed from the noise and the struggle. The figures we met, Edward, Joan, Henry, Charles, are at peace now, resting in the quiet vaults of history, their passions cooled, their stories told. Let the tension in your body dissolve like mist in the morning sun. Let your breathing slow down, matching the slow, steady pulse of the earth. The past is a dream, and the present is a soft, warm blanket wrapping around you. There is nothing left to fight, nothing left to win. Just the quiet, just the dark, just the peace. Drift away on the river of time, carried gently toward the shores of sleep, where the only battles are the ones we choose to dream, and even those are soft and far away. The night is yours. The silence is a gift. Close your eyes and let the darkness hold you. Sweet dreams.